What if one of the greatest capitals of the ancient world stood in plain sight, yet no one realized what it truly was for centuries beneath forgotten ruins, broken stones and layers of history lies a city that once shaped empires before disappearing from memory? How could an entire capital be misidentified for so long, and what finally revealed its incredible secret? Stay with us as we uncover the astonishing story of the ancient capital no one recognized for centuries. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into history's greatest forgotten mysteries. Now let's step back in time. The stones lie on the high Anatolian plateau as if a giant hand has scattered them there and then forgotten the reason. Wind moves across the grass. Clouds drag their shadows over the broken ridges. A road climbs toward walls that no longer protect anything, and beyond those walls the remains of a city spread across the hills in fragments, gateways with worn lions, foundations of temples, buried rooms, collapsed towers and slopes, where ancient footsteps have vanished so completely that for centuries almost no one understands what this place truly is. To a passerby, it might seem like another ruined stronghold in a land filled with older empires. To a shepherd moving through the countryside, it might be useful only as a landmark, a place of stones and silence. Yet beneath this silence once stood Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, a city that ruled over kings, commanded armies, stored treaties in clay, and stood at the center of a world powerful enough to challenge Egypt itself. The strangeness is not only that such a city fell. Ancient capitals fall often enough in history, and the earth is crowded with places that once believed themselves permanent. The deeper mystery is that Hattusa does not simply collapse into ruin. It disappears from recognition. Its name survives in old texts, its empire leaves marks across the Near East, its rulers speak through treaties and royal boasts and diplomatic letters, but the capital itself becomes almost invisible. Centuries pass, empires rise over the memory of earlier empires, languages change, roads shift, the old gods lose their worshippers. A city once filled with scribes, priests, soldiers, metalworkers, cooks, messengers and royal officials becomes a confusion of walls on a lonely plateau. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story ahead is not only about stones being uncovered, it's about how an entire civilization can stand in plain sight and still remain unseen. Hattusa sits near modern Boğazkale in central Turkey, far from the better-known river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia. It is not placed beside a broad, glittering river like the Nile, nor at the heart of a flat alluvial plain, where irrigation canals draw straight lines through the soil. Its world is harsher, more broken, more elevated. The landscape rises and folds into ridges of limestone and rugged slopes. Winters can be severe. Summers can dry the ground until the grasses turn pale. This is a place of springs, ravines, rocky outcrops and distant horizons. At first glance it does not look like the obvious seat of an empire, yet that is part of its power. The city is not built to dazzle from a riverbank. It is built into a landscape that can be defended, watched, controlled and transformed. Its hills become ramparts, its narrow approaches become guarded passages, its elevated position allows authority to feel embedded in the earth itself. Long before modern archaeologists begin to understand the site, the ruins already carry signs of unusual ambition. The city is not small. It stretches over a wide, uneven terrain with an upper city and lower city, with monumental gates placed where the defences bend along the slopes. The Lion Gate, the King's Gate and the Sphinx Gate are not decorative accidents. They belong to a world that wants stone to speak before any human official does. Their carved figures announce danger, order, sacred power and royal presence. Even broken, even weathered, they still hold a severe dignity. The lions are not soft symbols. They stand like guardians of a threshold between the ordinary land outside and the controlled, ritualized imperial world within. What survives in the record suggests that Hattusa is both a capital and a statement, both a living city and an argument made in stone. For centuries, however, that argument goes unread. The people who pass near the ruins do not possess the old Hittite archives. They do not hear the voices sealed in the tablets beneath the dust. They may see walls, gates, and strange carvings, but ruins without a readable name become strangely vulnerable. They can be misidentified, simplified, folded into local legend, or dismissed as the remains of some vague ancient people. This is one of history's quieter cruelties. A city can survive physically yet lose its identity. Hattusa does not vanish because every stone is removed. It vanishes because the connection between the stones and the people who built them is broken. The Hittites themselves once stand among the great powers of the late Bronze Age. Their kings ruled from Anatolia and influence lands reaching into northern Syria. They negotiate with Egypt, fight with Egypt, and sign one of the most famous peace treaties of the ancient world. They inherit and adapt traditions from older Anatolian communities, Mesopotamian scribal culture, Hurrian religion, and neighbouring societies. Their world is not isolated. It is intensely connected, full of messengers, merchants, hostages, marriage alliances, tribute ritual obligations, and military campaigns. Yet for a long time outside of specialist study, the Hittites feel almost like late arrivals in the popular imagination of antiquity. Egypt has pyramids and golden tombs. Mesopotamia has ziggurats and flood stories. Greece has epics and marble ruins. Hatti, despite its power, slips more easily into obscurity. Part of the reason lies in the nature of survival. The Hittites write many of their records on clay tablets, which is fortunate when fire hardens them, and disastrous when archives are scattered, buried, or left unread. Their capital is inland, away from the grand tourist circuits that later define ancient history for the wider world. Their language, written in cuneiform, waits for decipherment. Their monuments do not offer the same immediate visual familiarity as Egyptian temples or Greek columns. The evidence remains incomplete, and for centuries the incomplete record shapes the scale of the misunderstanding. Hattusa is there, but its meaning is locked. The plateau keeps its secret with patience. Seasons pass over the ruins. Snow settles in the cracks of stones that once formed official buildings. Wild plants grow where processions may have moved. Birds cross above gates designed for kings. The remains of reservoirs, fortifications, and temples sit under open sky, stripped of the sounds that once gave them purpose. There are no scribes hurrying through palace offices with damp clay tablets. There are no priests preparing offerings before the images of gods. There are no guards watching for envoys from Syria, no cooks feeding labourers, no animals being led toward ritual spaces, no royal messengers arriving with news from the frontiers. The city has become a landscape, and the landscape does not explain itself. Still, the scale refuses to disappear entirely. Even in ruin, Hattusa is too large to be ordinary. Its walls climb and curve with a confidence that hints at centralized planning. Its gates are placed with theatrical precision. Its temples are numerous enough to suggest not merely local worship, but a sacred capital filled with divine obligations. Its great archive areas eventually reveal a world of administration, law, diplomacy, myth, and ritual complexity. Scholars still debate many details of how the city functioned at different moments, how its population shifted, and how its final abandonment unfolded, but no serious reading of the evidence reduces Hattusa to a minor settlement. It is a capital built for an empire that sees itself as chosen, threatened, and necessary. The first layer of the mystery, then, is a problem of recognition. How does a capital like this become anonymous? How does a city that once helped shape the politics of the ancient Near East become a place that has to be rediscovered almost from the beginning? The answer is not a single catastrophe, not one fire, not one invading army, not one forgotten inscription. It is a slow unthreading. Political power breaks. Language dies from daily use. Archives are buried. Roads lose importance. New peoples inherit the land without inheriting the full memory of what stood there before. Later observers see the ruins through the limits of their own knowledge. The city remains, but the story that makes it visible is gone. And so the journey into Hattusa begins with a paradox. The ancient capital is not hidden beneath an ocean, not swallowed entirely by jungle, not erased so completely that only legend remains. It stands under the Anatolian sky, worn but present, waiting for centuries to be properly named. Its stones have endured storms, frost heat, neglect, and misunderstanding. They have waited while other civilizations became famous, while other ruins became symbols, while the Hittites lingered at the edge of historical memory. When the city finally begins to speak again, it does so in fragments: a carved gate, a broken wall, a tablet pulled from the earth, a royal name, a treaty, a ritual, a line of cuneiform that restores a voice to the silence. But before those tablets can speak, before the empire can be reconstructed, before the forgotten capital can regain its place in history, the land itself has to be understood. Hattusa is not an accident placed on a hill. It grows from the plateau, from the roots that cross Anatolia, from the pressures of trade and war, from springs and ridgelines, and the deep human instinct to turn difficult landscapes into centers of power. The city that no one recognized for centuries begins long before its walls rise high enough to impress a king. It begins with a place that seems remote until one learns how to look at it. Before Hattusa becomes an imperial capital, before its gates carry lions and sphinxes, before its archives hold the voices of kings, the plateau itself is already shaping the kind of power that can rise there. Central Anatolia is not a gentle cradle in the way later storytellers often imagine the birthplaces of civilization. It is a land of distances, exposed ridges, sharp seasonal change, and routes that matter precisely because movement is never effortless. The ground rolls outward in high plains and broken hills crossed by valleys that guide travelers, traders, herders, and armies through a difficult interior. In winter, cold can harden the world into silence. In summer, heat and drought can strip the slopes to pale earth and dry grass. Yet scattered through this demanding landscape are springs, pockets of arable soil, timbered uplands, mineral resources, and defensible heights. A settlement that learns how to command such a place does not merely survive, it begins to control movement itself. The future site of Hattusa lies in a natural basin surrounded by rocky heights with steep outcrops and narrow approaches that offer protection without completely cutting the settlement off from the wider world. This balance matters. A capital cannot be too exposed, but it also cannot be unreachable. It must receive tribute, grain, metal, people, messages, animals, and authority from many directions. The region around Hattusa offers a strange combination of difficulty and opportunity. It is guarded by the land, but not imprisoned by it. Routes passing through Anatolia connect the interior to the Black Sea lands, to northern Syria, to Mesopotamian trade networks, and to the Aegean world in more indirect ways. No single road explains the city's rise, and scholars still debate the exact weight of trade, military geography, and local political tradition. But the basic pattern is clear enough. This is a place where control of passage can become control of power. Long before the Hittites turn Hattusa into the heart of their kingdom, central Anatolia is already inhabited by communities with their own settlements, rivalries, cult places, and economic life. The region is not empty land waiting for empire. Farming villages, fortified towns, and trading centres appear across the plateau. People grow grain where conditions allow 10 livestock work, metal exchange goods, and build local identities long before Hittite kings place their stamp on the landscape. What survives in the archaeological record suggests a world of small powers and shifting alliances, where towns may rise around defensible hills, and where control of resources can decide which family chief or ruler gains influence. The later empire grows from this older Anatolian foundation, not from a sudden arrival out of nowhere. One of the lesser-known but important features of this world is its connection to long-distance commerce during the early second millennium before the Common Era, especially the network of Assyrian merchant colonies known from sites such as Kanesh. These merchants bring tin textiles, silver, and written records into Anatolia, linking local rulers to faraway economic systems. Their tablets reveal contract, debts, marriages, disputes, caravans, and a practical world of profit and risk. Hattusa itself is connected to this broader age of trade and competing city-states, though the evidence remains uneven and incomplete. The important point is that writing commerce and political calculation are already present in Anatolia before the Hittite imperial age. The future capital rises in a land that has already learned the value of records, metals, routes, and fortified authority. The natural setting of Hattusa makes more sense when imagined not as a flat map but as a body of stone and slope. The lower areas offer room for settlement, storage, and movement, while the heights above can be fortified and monumentalized. Springs provide water, though water management remains a constant concern in such an environment. Rocky ridges create dramatic boundaries, and the terrain itself seems to invite walls. Later builders do not impose a simple geometric plan upon an empty plain. They negotiate with the land. They use its folds, its rises, its limits. This is one reason the city feels so distinctive in ruin. Hattusa does not resemble a capital laid out only by rulers' command. It feels like a capital grown in argument with geology. That geology also shapes imagination. In ancient Anatolia, mountains, springs, storms, and rocks are not merely background scenery. They belong to a sacred environment. The Hittite religious world, when it later becomes visible through texts, is full of weather gods, local deities, sacred mountains, and rituals tied to place. It would be too simple to claim that geography alone creates belief, but the landscape around Hattusa certainly offers a powerful stage for sacred kingship. Storms gathering over the plateau, water emerging from the earth, cliffs enclosing valleys, and high paths leading toward defended gates all give the city an atmosphere of controlled danger. A ruler here can appear not only as a political figure but as someone standing between human settlement and the unstable forces surrounding it. The plateau also teaches caution. A society based in this interior cannot rely on endless agricultural abundance in the way Egypt relies on the Nile's predictable renewal. Harvests can fail. Pastures can shrink. Snow and distance can slow communication. Maintaining an imperial center here requires planning, storage, redistribution, and the ability to pull resources from a wide territory. Later Hittite administration will show deep concern with grain labor ritual obligations, military readiness, and loyalty from subordinate regions. The city's environment does not make empire impossible, but it makes empire demanding. It rewards organization and punishes complacency. No single explanation fully accounts for why Hattusa becomes the chosen capital, Yet its setting reveals why rulers who mastered it could project unusual strength. There is also the matter of defense. In a world where rival kings, raiders, rebellious towns, and foreign powers can threaten the stability of a kingdom, a capital must be more than an administrative centre. It must be a refuge, a symbol, and a warning. The slopes around Hattusa allow fortifications to dominate the approaches. An enemy cannot simply roll across open land and arrive at the palace gates without being observed. The terrain slows, movement breaks formations, and forces attackers into predictable lines. Later Hittite builders make this advantage monumental, but the defensive logic exists in the place itself. The city's future walls do not invent its strength, they amplify it. Yet the same landscape that protects Hattusa also contributes to its later obscurity. Capitals on famous rivers are remembered partly because later civilizations continue to travel those same river corridors. Cities on enduring coastlines may remain visible through maritime routes. Hattusa sits inland in a high and changing world where political roots can fade. Once the empire collapses and the administrative system no longer pulls people toward the capital, the site loses the constant traffic that keeps memory alive. The plateau can preserve ruins physically while allowing their identity to dissolve. Stones remain, but fewer and fewer people arrive with the old names. This is one of the quiet ironies of Hattusa's beginning. The very features that make the site powerful also help make it forgettable after power is gone. Its defensible heights, its inland position, its rugged dignity, its distance from later centres of classical fame all serve the empire while the empire lives, then isolate its remains after the empire falls. A capital built from the logic of the plateau becomes in time a ruin returned to the plateau. The land that once lifted it into history later folds it back into silence. Still, nothing about Hattusa's rise should be imagined as inevitable. Many strong places never become capitals. Many fortified towns remain local powers. For Hattusa to become the heart of a kingdom, geography has to meet ambition. The plateau offers the stage, but people bring the violence, ritual administration, memory, and will require to transform a settlement into a royal centre. Somewhere in the long movement from local stronghold to imperial city, rulers begin to see in these hills more than shelter. They see a place from which a kingdom can be gathered, commanded, and made sacred. The landscape provides the bones. The coming Hittite state gives those bones a body. The transformation of Hattusa from a strong place on the plateau into the heart of a kingdom does not happen as a clean beginning with a single founding moment. It emerges through conflict, inheritance, destruction, and deliberate return. The city already has importance before the Hittite kings make it their capital, and the older name of the place seems to echo through the records like a voice from beneath the empire. It is associated with Hattian traditions with the pre-Hittite world of central Anatolia, and with a local identity older than the Indo-European speaking rulers who later dominate the region. The Hittites do not simply build on empty land. They take over a living landscape of names, gods, memories, and rival claims, and by choosing Hattusa they bind their own royal future to an older Anatolian past. One of the most striking traditions connected with the city is that an earlier ruler, Anita of Kusara, is said to have destroyed Hattusa and cursed anyone who might rebuild it. The details remain debated because the surviving text belongs to a royal and literary world where memory can serve political purposes as much as simple reporting. Yet the story matters even if every detail cannot be treated as straightforward fact. It suggests that Hattusa was already important enough to be hated, feared, and symbolically erased. A minor village does not receive that kind of memory. A place worth cursing is a place worth controlling. If the later Hittite kings return to Hattusa after such a tradition, the act is more than practical settlement. It becomes a declaration that royal power can break an old warning and turn a forbidden ruin into the centre of a new order. By the 17th century before the Common Era, the early Hittite kingdom begins to take shape under rulers who draw together central and Anatolian power and push outward into neighbouring regions. Hattusili I, whose very royal name is tied to Hattusa, stands near the beginning of this process. His reign is remembered for campaigns' expansion and the strengthening of kingship, though the evidence remains incomplete, and often filtered through later copies of royal texts. What survives suggests a world in motion, not a stable empire already fully formed. The king must fight, negotiate, punish, reward, and constantly assert his authority over towns and regions that may not accept central control easily. Hattusa becomes the place from which this difficult gathering of power is imagined and administered. The choice of Hattusa gives the kingdom a heart, but that heart beats in a dangerous body. Early Hittite power is not gentle. It is built through military movement, dynastic struggle, and the hard work of binding local elites to the throne. Royal family politics can be brutal, and succession is often unstable. The capital is not merely a grand residence. It is the stage on which royal legitimacy must be performed again and again. In its halls and courtyards, officials serve the king, priests maintain divine favour, scribes preserve commands, and messengers carry orders into the territories beyond the plateau. The city becomes the place where authority is concentrated so that it can be sent outward. This is one of the important differences between a large settlement and a capital. A settlement may contain many people, markets, workshops, and shrines. A capital turns those things into instruments of rule. Hattusa does not only house the king, it gathers the gods of the kingdom, receives tribute stores, goods, preserves treaties, and transforms distant regions into something legible to the court. Grain, livestock, metal textiles, soldiers, labourers, ritual specialists, foreign envoys and local chiefs all pass in some way through the system centred there. Not all of them physically enter the city, but the city gives shape to the relationships that bind them. The capital becomes a machine of memory and command. The Hittites are especially skilled at absorbing and reorganising. Their culture is not a sealed ethnic block spreading unchanged over Anatolia. It is a layered political world that incorporates Hattian traditions, Hurrian influences, Mesopotamian scribal habits, Syrian connections, and local cults. Hattusa reflects this mixture. Its rulers use cuneiform, a writing system inherited through older Near Eastern traditions, while their own language and several others appear in the archive. They worship a vast and sometimes bewildering range of deities, many of them adopted from different regions. They preserve myths, rituals, laws, treaties, omens, and instructions. The city's strength lies partly in its ability to gather diversity under royal supervision. The empire that grows from Hattusa is not simple, and its capital is not culturally narrow. Daily life in this rising capital must have carried the feeling of constant preparation. The court depends on scribes who can record, copy, classify, and retrieve information. Soldiers and chariot forces require maintenance, training animals and equipment. Temples require offerings, purification festivals and personnel. Storehouses need accounting. Palaces need food, fuel, textiles, metal goods and labour. Even the most dramatic royal campaign begins in ordinary systems. Carts loaded animals, fed tablets, sealed orders, repeated roads watched. A lesser-known detail of Hittite administration is how deeply ritual and bureaucracy are intertwined. Instructions for officials, festival texts, and diplomatic documents all belong to the same world of careful procedure. In Hattusa, ruling is not only a matter of force, it is also a matter of doing things in the correct order before the correct witnesses under the eyes of the correct gods. The city grows because the kingdom grows, and the kingdom grows because Hattusa gives ambition a durable centre. From this high capital, Hittite rulers expand into northern Syria, where they confront other powers and seize cities whose names belong to the great map of the late Bronze Age. They look south and east toward lands tied to Mesopotamia and the Levant. They deal with rivals such as Mitanni and later Assyria. They eventually face Egypt not as a remote curiosity, but as a competing great power in the struggle over Syria. The rise of Hattusa therefore changes the balance of the ancient Near East. A place that later travellers fail to recognise becomes in its own age one of the command points of international politics. Yet the early rise is never free of fragility. Royal texts often present kings as strong-favoured and victorious, but the need to proclaim order so frequently hints at how difficult order is to maintain. The Hittite state must manage rebellious subjects, ambitious relatives, distant vassals, and the unpredictable consequences of campaigning far from home. Scholars still debate the pace and character of Hattusa's development across the early kingdom and the later imperial period, but the broad pattern is unmistakable. The capital becomes more monumental as the demands placed upon it increase. The city has to look like the centre of the world because the world it rules is always threatening to pull apart. In this sense, Hattusa is not born as a peaceful administrative jewel. It is forged as a royal answer to instability. Its walls, temples, archives, and palace spaces grow from the need to concentrate authority in a landscape of competing powers. The Hittite kings make the city a heart but also a fortress of legitimacy. They return to a place once associated with destruction and transform it into the seat of kings who claim the right to command lands far beyond the plateau. The old curse, whether history, memory, or political theatre, becomes part of the city's strange power. Hattusa rises as a capital that should perhaps not have returned at all, and for several centuries that return changes the history of the ancient world. As Hattusa grows into the heart of Hittite power, the city begins to arm itself in stone. The plateau has already given it height slopes and difficult approaches, but royal authority does not leave those advantages in their natural state. It reshapes them, sharpens them, and turns them into a visible language of control. The walls of Hattusa do not merely keep enemies out. They announce that the people inside understand fear well enough to build against it. They also understand theatre well enough to make defence look sacred, royal, and almost inevitable. To approach the city in its great age is not simply to come near a settlement. It is to be guided through a landscape of warning. The fortifications of Hattusa follow the broken form of the terrain, climbing along ridges and enclosing both lower and upper areas of the city. Their course is not the neat square of an ideal plan drawn on flat ground. It bends, rises, descends, and takes advantage of the hills. This makes the defences feel as though they belong to the earth, as if the city has grown a hard outer shell from the plateau itself. In places the walls stand on artificial ramparts with stone foundations and mud brick superstructures rising above them. What survives today is only a reduced remnant of the original effect. The upper parts are gone, the wooden elements have vanished, and the surfaces that once looked freshly built have weathered into ruin. Yet even in that reduced state the scale is enough to suggest the labour behind it. Quarrying, hauling, shaping, stacking, plastering, repairing and organising workers across years of royal command. The gates are the most memorable survivors because they turn practical entry points into symbolic thresholds. The Lion Gate with its carved guardians presents the image of strength at the edge of the city. The animals are not decorative in a modern sense. They stand where danger and protection meet, marking the passage into a space governed by royal and divine order. The King's Gate with its armed figure carries another kind of message. The identity of the figure has been debated. It may represent a god rather than a human king, and the evidence remains incomplete. That uncertainty is revealing because in the Hittite world, royal power and divine protection are never far apart. A gate can defend the city with masonry, while also defending it with meaning. The Sphinx Gate is stranger still. It belongs to the high southern defences where the city's wall crosses a great artificial rampart at Yerkaper. This area is one of the most dramatic pieces of Hittite engineering at Hattusa. A massive sloping embankment rises like a constructed hill, faced with stone, and a tunnel passes through it below. The tunnel is often described as a postern, though its exact function remains debated. It may have served practical movement defensive needs, ceremonial purposes, or several roles over time. What matters is the impression it creates. The city does not simply block the landscape, it stages the landscape. It builds a mountain-like form, cuts a passage through it, and crowns it with a gate guarded by hybrid figures. The result is military architecture with an almost ritual presence. That blend of defense and ceremony is typical of Hattusa. The walls protect, but they also organize experience. Anyone entering through the gates is made aware of crossing from one condition into another. Outside lies the open plateau with its roots, fields, threats, and uncertainties. Inside lies the king's city, the place of temples, archives, storehouses, and official order. This contrast must have mattered in a world where political authority is constantly tested. A vassal ruler arriving at Hattusa, a foreign envoy bringing messages, or a local official summoned to court would not experience the capital as an abstract idea. The approach itself would teach a lesson. The city is high-guarded, carved, and watched. It is not easily entered. There is a lesser-known detail in the defensive system that reveals the sophistication of Hittite planning. The walls are not simply passive barriers. They include towers, controlled gates, and concealed or secondary passages that could allow movement under protected conditions. Ancient warfare often depends as much on psychology and logistics as on direct assault. A strong wall can slow an enemy, but it can also exhaust morale, force delays, protect supplies, and make attackers vulnerable, while defenders choose the terms of engagement. Hattusa's fortifications reflect this wider reality. The city is not designed for one dramatic siege scene. It is designed for a world in which danger may come repeatedly from rebels, rivals, raiders, or great armies moving through contested lands. The anxieties behind such construction are not imaginary. The Hittite kingdom exists in a competitive Late Bronze Age environment. To the south and southeast lie regions of immense strategic value, especially northern Syria, where Hittite ambitions collide with those of other great powers. To the east, the balance shifts over time as Mitanni weakens and Assyria grows more formidable. Within Anatolia itself, the Hittite kings must deal with difficult frontier zones and recurring unrest, including threats from groups often identified in the texts as the Kaska people to the north. These enemies are not always easy to define archaeologically, and scholars still debate their organization and movements, but Hittite records show that the northern frontier remains a persistent problem. For a capital in central Anatolia, security is not a distant concern. It is a condition of survival. Hattusa itself is attacked and damaged at different moments in its history. The city's rulers know that capitals can burn. They know that gods must be appeased, walls maintained, soldiers supplied, and loyalty enforced. The very monumentality of the defences may reflect both confidence and vulnerability. Powerful states build impressive walls because they can. They also build them because they have reason to fear what happens if they do not. In this sense, the walls of Hattusa are not only evidence of strength, they are evidence of pressure. They show a kingdom wealthy and organized enough to command enormous labor, yet never secure enough to stop thinking about the next threat. The construction of such defences also changes the inner life of the city. Walls define movement. Gates regulate access. Certain roads become more important because they lead through controlled points. Guards, gatekeepers, officials, and ritual personnel all become part of the daily functioning of defence. Animals, carts, messengers, workers, and visitors do not simply drift in and out. They pass through systems of observation and permission. The capital's physical shape teaches hierarchy. Some spaces are public, some restricted, some sacred, some royal, and some hidden behind layers of architecture and authority. The wall is therefore not just the city's edge, it is part of the city's mind. From a distance, the fortified capital must have appeared as a controlled interruption in the wildness of the plateau. Walls traced the ridges, gates opened like deliberate wounds in the stone body of the city. Towers watched the approaches. Above them, temples and official buildings rose in stages across the terrain. Smoke from hearths and workshops may have drifted upward. Processions may have moved along roads inside the walls. Royal messengers may have entered dusty from long journeys, carrying news that could change the fate of border towns. The city's defences held all of this within a single frame, making everyday life possible, under the constant assumption that danger might return. What survives today can make the ancient effort seem quieter than it was. Ruined walls invite slow walking and contemplation. Weathered gates become objects of photography and study. But in their own time, these structures are not quiet. They are active instruments of a state that understands the value of intimidation order and sacred display. They are built from stone, mud brick, timber, labour fear, and royal ambition. They reveal a capital that does not trust the world beyond its gates, even as it depends on that world for tribute soldiers, goods, and recognition. The walls of Hattusa therefore stand at the meeting point of geography and empire. The plateau gives the city its defensive possibilities, but the Hittite state turns those possibilities into monumental fact. Each gate tower, tunnel, and rampart says that the capital is not merely located in a strong place. It has made strength visible. Yet this visibility carries a shadow. A city that builds so powerfully against danger also preserves the memory of danger in every stone. Hattusa rises as a heart of empire, but around that heart is a hardened shell, and the shell tells its own story. Power here is never relaxed. It is guarded, carved, watched, and always aware that beyond the walls the ancient world is moving. Inside the walls, Hattusa is not a city of empty monuments. It is a working capital crowded with the routines that make empire possible. The ruins may now appear still and spacious beneath the open sky, but in its living age the city is full of movement, smoke voices, animals, tools, ceremonies, and instructions carried from one official space to another. Its streets do not belong only to kings and priests. They belong to labourers hauling supplies, scribes carrying tablets, guards changing posts, women grinding grain, craftsmen shaping metal, and wood servants moving through palace service areas, messengers arriving from distant provinces, and animals being driven towards storage yards, kitchens, or ritual spaces. The capital is grand because it is sacred and royal, but it survives because thousands of ordinary tasks are repeated with discipline. The lower city appears to have been one of the older occupied areas, with domestic buildings, official structures, and the great temple complex that later becomes one of the most important known religious spaces of Hattusa. The upper city, developed more extensively in the imperial period, contains many temples and monumental features spread across the slopes. The division is not simply a neat separation between common life and elite life, because ancient cities rarely obey such tidy modern categories. Sacred administrative and practical functions overlap. A temple can be a religious center, an economic institution, a storage complex and a workplace. A palace can be a residence, a court, an archive, a ceremonial setting, and a machine for issuing commands. What survives in the record suggests that Hattusa is layered in this way, with each building participating in several systems at once. The Great Temple in the lower city offers one of the clearest windows into this world. It is not only a place where people imagine the gods in distant abstraction. It is an organized complex with storerooms, courtyards, controlled access, and carefully maintained ritual life. The main sanctuary is often associated with the storm god and the sun goddess of Arinna, two central figures in the Hittite religious world, though the full details of cult practice remain incomplete. Around the temple are spaces that point to storage and administration, reminding us that worship in such a capital requires material support. Offerings must be gathered, vessels must be prepared, textiles, food, incense, animals, and ritual equipment must be stored, counted, cleaned, and used at the proper time. The sacred life of the city rests on practical labour. This practical labour is one of the easiest things to underestimate when looking at ruins. Stone foundations survive better than baskets, ropes, wooden shelves, leather straps, woolen cloth, bread, beer, oil, and human fatigue. Yet these perishable things make the city function. A royal festival may appear in the tablets as a sequence of formal acts, but behind those acts is a hidden army of workers preparing food, arranging processions, cleaning spaces, managing animals, and ensuring that the correct objects arrive in the correct place. A king's command may be preserved as writing, but before it becomes a tablet, it passes through a human chain of decision dictation, shaping wet clay, pressing signs, drying, storing, and later retrieving. The evidence remains incomplete, but the surviving administrative and ritual texts make one thing clear: Hattusa is a city of procedures. In the palace and official quarters, scribes occupy a world both humble and powerful. They do not rule in their own names, but without them the empire's memory fails. They copy treaties, rituals, letters, laws, inventories, myths, prayers, instructions, and historical narratives. They work in cuneiform, adapting a writing tradition that reaches back into Mesopotamia, and they preserve not only Hittite, but also other languages used in diplomacy, ritual, and scholarship. Their craft requires training, patience, and accuracy. A tablet is small enough to be held in the hand, yet it can carry the obligations of kings. A misplaced sign may alter meaning. A broken tablet may fracture a law, a myth, or a diplomatic promise. In a city later forgotten for centuries, it is these quiet clay objects that eventually become some of the strongest witnesses. Workshops add another layer of life. The Hittite world is famous in older popular imagination for iron, sometimes too simply described, as if the Hittites alone suddenly unlocked an Iron Age ahead of everyone else. The real picture is more cautious. Bronze remains crucial in the Late Bronze Age, and iron objects exist but are often rare, valuable and symbolically charged, before iron becomes widespread for ordinary tools and weapons. Still, metalworking is important, and Anatolia's mineral resources give the region strategic weight. Craftsmen in and around Hattusa work with bronze-copper alloys, gold, silver, and iron in limited contexts, along with stone, bone, wood, leather, and textiles. Their products serve war worship, luxury agriculture, and administration. Chariot fittings, weapons, ritual vessels, seals, tools, ornaments, and containers all connect manual skill to imperial power. Food production and storage are equally central. The capital must be fed even when weather is poor or campaigns draw resources away. Grain is not glamorous, but it is one of the foundations of kingship. Storehouses and administrative records point to a system concerned with collection and redistribution. Animals provide meat, wool, hides, traction, and ritual offerings. Bread and beer likely belong to daily diets and ceremonial obligations, though exact patterns vary by status, season, and context. The king's table, the temple's offerings, and the worker's ration are not separate from politics. They are expressions of a system in which the central authority gathers the produce of the land and redistributes it in ways that maintain hierarchy and loyalty. The human population of Hattusa is difficult to estimate with certainty, and scholars still debate its size at different periods. It may have expanded and contracted depending on political stability, building activity, festivals, and crisis. A capital is not only its permanent residence, it also includes visitors, temporary labourers, envoys, soldiers deported or relocated people, and specialists brought for particular tasks. During major festivals, the city's population and energy may have swelled. Roads inside the walls would have carried processions, animals, officials, and participants moving between temples and sacred places. On quieter days, the city would have returned to its more ordinary rhythm of storage, repair, preparation, and administration. There is also a domestic Hattusa, harder to see but essential. Families live within the orbit of palace and temple power. Houses would have contained hearths, storage jars, tools, sleeping areas, and workspaces. Women's labour, often less visible in royal records, would have been central to textile production, food, preparation, household management, childcare, and possibly market or service activities, depending on status and context. Children would have grown up beneath the shadow of walls and gods, learning the sounds of animals, carts, tools, and official processions before they understood the political system that made such sounds possible. The capital is an imperial machine, but it is also a place where people wake hungry, mend things, worry about weather, fall ill, make offerings, and grow old. What makes Hattusa especially compelling is the way ordinary life and cosmic order seem to interlock. A broken jar, a missing animal, a delayed shipment, an improperly performed ritual, or a rebellious vassal can all become part of the same anxious world. The Hittite state is deeply concerned with correctness. Ritual errors matter, oaths matter, records matter, loyalty matters, purity matters. This does not mean that life is rigid every moment, but it does mean that the capital carries a constant burden of maintenance. The kingdom must be kept aligned with the gods, the provinces, the army, the harvest, and the royal house. Hattusa is where that alignment is attempted again and again. In the end, the city's inner life reveals why it could be forgotten, and later rediscovered only with effort. Hattusa's greatness was not contained in one pyramid, one tomb, or one instantly recognizable monument. It was distributed across systems, archives, temples, gates, storerooms, workshops, roads, rituals, and offices. When those systems stopped functioning, the visible remains lost much of their meaning. A temple without offerings becomes walls. An archive without readers becomes baked clay. A palace without court ceremony becomes foundations on a hill. Yet beneath the ruins, the old patterns waited. The city that seemed silent was not empty of testimony. It had preserved the traces of an entire world of work, fear, devotion, and command sealed into the ground one object at a time. The most powerful voices of Hattusa are not carved into towering stone for everyone to see. They're small, dense, and easily missed clay tablets pressed with signs, while still damp then dried, stored, broken, buried, and left beneath the ruins until the city's silence begins to crack open. If the walls reveal the fear and confidence of a capital, the tablets reveal its mind. They do not speak in one grand story. They speak in fragments of law, ritual diplomacy, myth, inventory instruction, prayer, omen, complaint, and royal memory. Together they show that Hattusa is not only a place of impressive ruins, It is one of the great written archives of the Late Bronze Age, and without those tablets the Hittites might have remained far more shadowy, known mostly through the records of others, and the scattered traces of a power whose centre no one had fully understood. The archive is not a library in the modern sense arranged for quiet reading by curious citizens. It belongs to a royal and administrative world where writing serves authority, religion, memory, and control. Clay tablets are practical objects. They can be held, stacked, sealed, copied, stored in rooms, and retrieved when needed. Some are carefully composed. Others are working documents, rough or damaged or incomplete. Many survive as fragments because buildings collapse, shelves rot, tablets break, and time does its slow violence. Yet even fragments can be astonishing. A broken ritual text may preserve the name of a god from a distant town. A treaty fragment may reveal the delicate relationship between a great king and a vassal. A law tablet may show how society classifies injury, property, marriage, theft, and compensation. What survives in the record suggests a state deeply invested in the written management of both human and divine obligations. The scribes who produce these tablets belong to a demanding profession. They use cuneiform, a script with origins far older than the Hittite kingdom inherited through Mesopotamian scribal tradition, and adapted to Hittite needs. Writing in cuneiform is not like casually drawing letters. It requires training the hand to press wedge-shaped signs into clay, with a stylus learning sign, values conventions, languages, and formulas. Hattusa's scribal world is multilingual. Hittite appears in the tablets, but so do Akkadian used widely in international diplomacy, along with Hattic Hurrian, Luwian Sumerian logograms and other elements embedded in learned tradition. The capital's archive is therefore not just a record of one language. It is evidence of a cosmopolitan court that gathers older traditions and neighbouring cultures into its own system of rule. This multilingual character is one of the surprises that makes Hattusa so valuable. The Hittite Empire is sometimes imagined as a single solid block, but the tablets reveal a far more layered world. Rituals may preserve words from older Anatolian cults. Myths may carry Hurrian influence. Diplomatic texts may follow Akkadian conventions understood across royal courts. Administrative documents may use formulas familiar to trained scribes, but opaque to ordinary people. The archive becomes a meeting place of languages, just as the capital is a meeting place of regions. No single explanation fully accounts for how all these traditions were selected, translated, preserved, and adapted, but their presence shows that Hittite power depends not on cultural purity but on controlled accumulation. Among the most dramatic tablets are those linked to diplomacy. Hittite kings live in a world of treaties, oaths, hostages, marriages, border arrangements, and carefully measured prestige. The ruler of Hatti calls himself a great king, a title that places him in the same diplomatic universe as Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and other major powers at different times. Words matter in this world because they define loyalty and hierarchy. A treaty with a vassal does not simply say that one ruler obeys another. It invokes gods as witnesses, lists obligations, recalls past favours or betrayals, and threatens curses if the agreement is broken. The clay tablet is not just information. It is a political instrument backed by divine fear. The archive also preserves laws, and these laws offer a more grounded glimpse of society. They do not describe daily life in full, and scholars still debate how closely written laws reflect actual practice, but they reveal categories of concern. Injuries have values. Animals have values. Property disputes, sexual conduct, marriage arrangements, and social status all appear in legal formulations. Compared with some older Near Eastern law collections, Hittite laws can sometimes seem less focused on severe bodily punishment and more on compensation, though this should not be mistaken for a gentle society. The world behind the laws remains hierarchical, patriarchal, and violent by modern standards. Still, the legal texts show a practical effort to define consequences, regulate conflict, and preserve order within a kingdom where many communities and customs must be governed under royal authority. Then there are the rituals, which may be the most revealing and the most strange to modern listeners. Hittite ritual texts can be extraordinarily detailed. They describe offerings, purification actions, festival sequences, substitute objects, gestures, movements, and spoken formulas. Some rituals respond to illness, impurity, bad omens, broken oaths, military concerns, royal anxieties, or divine anger. The procedures can seem almost bureaucratic in their precision, as if the unseen world can be approached through correct performance. A lesser-known detail is how many ritual specialists from different regions appear in these texts, including women experts in certain traditions. This suggests that the capital collects ritual knowledge much as it collects tribute and diplomatic obligations. Hattusa becomes a center where the sacred techniques of many places are recorded, copied, and made available to the royal system. Myths and prayers give the archive a different kind of depth. They reveal not only what the Hittites administer, but what they fear and imagine. Stories of vanished gods, storm deities, cosmic struggle and divine anger belong to a mental world in which political stability depends on relationships with powers beyond human control. The gods can withdraw, the land can suffer, the king can be endangered by ritual failure, the community can be threatened by pollution curse or neglected obligation. These texts should not be read as simple superstition, as if ancient people lacked practical intelligence. They belong to a coherent worldview in which weather, harvest, kingship, disease, war, and divine favor are woven tightly together. In a vulnerable plateau kingdom, that worldview has its own severe logic. The tablets also expose something more: human anxiety over memory. Copies are made, older texts are preserved, instructions are repeated, treaties are stored, rituals are written so they can be performed again. A capital like Hattusa cannot rely on human memory alone. Too much is at stake. The correct words must survive the death of one official and the appointment of another. The obligations of a vassal must not fade because a witness dies. The procedure for appeasing a deity must not vanish when an old ritual expert is gone. Writing becomes a defense against disorder, just as walls are a defense against enemies. One protects the city's body, the other protects its continuity. When the archive is finally found by modern excavators, it changes the scale of the Hittite story. The ruins already suggest importance, but the tablets prove complexity. They identify people, places, gods, conflicts, laws, fears, and ambitions. They allow scholars to connect Hattusa to names known from other ancient records. They help restore the Hittites as a major force in the Late Bronze Age, rather than a vague people at the edge of better-known civilizations. Yet the archive does not solve everything. Many tablets are broken. Many texts survive in copies whose original dates are uncertain. Some documents refer to events that remain difficult to place. The evidence remains incomplete, and the archive gives both illumination and frustration in equal measure. That incompleteness is part of the power of Hattusa. The tablets do not turn the city into a fully transparent world. They make it visible enough to be real and mysterious enough to remain alive. Through them, the ancient capital is no longer just walls on a hill. It becomes a place where scribes bend over clay, where royal commands take shape in wet earth, where gods are summoned through careful procedure, where vassals are bound by oath, where old languages survive in ritual memory, and where an empire tries to hold itself together by writing its obligations down. The city that no one recognized for centuries had not been silent after all. It had been speaking in clay, waiting for someone to learn how to listen. The tablets of Hattusa reveal a city with a mind, but they also point outward beyond the walls to the enormous and uneasy world that the Hittite kings try to command. A capital only becomes an imperial capital when distant places begin to answer to it, and Hattusa's power is never confined to the ridges around Boğazkale. From this high inland centre, royal authority stretches across much of Anatolia and reaches southward into northern Syria, where some of the most valuable cities and routes of the late Bronze Age lie exposed to the ambitions of every great power. The Hittite Empire is not a simple block of territory coloured neatly on a map. It is a shifting system of direct rule, vassal kingdoms, military roads, treaty obligations, religious bonds, dynastic marriages, threats, favours hostages and recurring rebellions. Its strength depends on making many different peoples behave as if Hattusa is the centre of their political world. The King of Hatti stands at the top of this system, but even the title of Great King conceals how much work is required to remain great. Hittite rulers do not govern every valley, town and frontier in the same way. Some areas are held more closely through officials and garrisons. Others are managed through local rulers who keep their thrones in exchange for loyalty, tribute, military support and obedience to Hittite foreign policy. These vassal arrangements are preserved in treaty texts that can be severe, detailed and deeply personal. A vassal is reminded of what the Hittite king has done for him, warned against secret alliances, commanded to report enemies and bound before the gods. Loyalty is not trusted as a natural condition. It is written, sworn, supervised and threatened. This tells us something important about the empire behind Hattusa. It is powerful, but it is not effortless. It must constantly transform relationships into obligations. A rebellious prince in western Anatolia, a shifting alliance in Syria, a hostile movement on the northern frontier, or a succession dispute inside the royal family can all disturb the system. The Hittite king needs armies, but armies alone cannot stand everywhere at once. He needs diplomacy, intimidation, marriage ties, religious legitimacy, and the ability to appear unavoidable. Hattusa, with its walls, temples, archives, and ceremonial authority, becomes the place where this unavoidable image is produced. The empire's southern ambitions are especially important. Northern Syria is one of the great crossroads of the ancient Near East, linking Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Levant and Egypt. Cities such as Aleppo, Karkemish, Ugarit and others belong to networks of trade, diplomacy and strategy. Control over these regions means access to routes, wealth, prestige and influence. It also means exposure to rivals. The Hittites cannot move into Syria without encountering the interests of Mitanni, Egypt and later Assyria. The political map is never still. One kingdom weakens, another expands, a vassal changes sides, a marriage alliance alters expectations, and suddenly a remote decision in one court affects the lives of people hundreds of miles away. Mitanni, a powerful Hurrian-speaking kingdom in northern Mesopotamia and Syria, stands for a time as one of Hatti's major rivals. The relationship between Hatti and Mitanni is complex, shifting through conflict diplomacy and eventual Hittite advantage as Mitanni weakens under pressure from both Hatti and Assyria. The details are not always easy to reconstruct because the evidence survives unevenly, and often from the perspective of royal claims. Yet the broad transformation is clear. Hittite kings succeed in pushing deep into regions once tied to Mitanni, and they install or support arrangements that bring key Syrian territories under Hittite influence. Karkemish becomes especially important, eventually serving as a major Hittite dynastic centre. in Syria. The empire does not simply conquer and leave. It creates political anchors beyond Anatolia. Egypt is the more famous rival because Egyptian monuments are louder in modern memory. The struggle between Hatti and Egypt over Syria becomes one of the defining contests of the Late Bronze Age. Egyptian pharaohs look northward to secure influence in the Levant and beyond. Hittite kings look southward for many of the same reasons. Between them lie vassal rulers whose loyalty can be uncertain and whose survival depends on reading the balance of power correctly. For a local ruler, choosing Egypt or Hatti is not an abstract diplomatic preference. It can decide whether a city is protected, punished, replaced, or dragged into war. Assyria adds another pressure, particularly as it expands and becomes more aggressive. For Hatti, Assyria is not merely a distant eastern kingdom. It is a rising force capable of threatening the balance that Hittite kings work to maintain. The Hittite court watches, reacts, negotiates, and worries. No single enemy explains the empire's later troubles, but the presence of strong rivals on multiple fronts helps reveal the permanent strain built into Hittite greatness. Hattusa may look secure in the mountains, but its empire lives on exposed edges. The western regions of Anatolia present their own challenges. Hittite texts refer to lands and powers in the west, including Arzawa and later Ahiawa, a name widely discussed because many scholars connect it in some way with Mycenaean Greek power, though the exact nature of that connection remains debated. These references open a tantalizing window onto a world where Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Eastern Mediterranean are more connected than older historical imagination once allowed. Hittite kings deal with Western rulers through campaigns, treaties, and warnings. The evidence remains incomplete, but it suggests that Hattusa's political horizon reaches toward regions that later Greek tradition would remember in very different forms. A lesser-known feature of Hittite imperial control is the use of royal family members as regional rulers. Rather than treating all conquered or subordinate lands as faceless provinces, the Hittite system often places trusted figures, including princes, in strategic centers. This can strengthen control, but it also creates risks. Powerful relatives with armies and local loyalties may become stabilizing pillars or future threats. Dynastic politics in Hatti are often tense, and royal edicts and prayers reveal anxiety about betrayal, legitimacy, and the consequences of disorder inside the ruling house. The empire depends on family, but family is one of the most dangerous materials from which to build a state. The military side of Hittite power rests heavily on organized campaigns, fortified centers, infantry, and chariotry. Chariots are prestige weapons and battlefield tools in the Late Bronze Age, requiring horses, trained crews, craftsmen, roads, and supply systems. They are not simply glamorous machines racing across open ground. They are expensive expressions of state capacity. Every chariot implies woodworkers, metal fittings, leather wheels, horse breeding, fodder training, and command structure. When Hittite armies move, they carry with them the hidden labour of the capital and provinces. War begins long before battle in storerooms, workshops, stables, and written orders. Diplomacy can be just as elaborate as war. Royal letters exchanged among great kings follow conventions of brotherhood, gift-giving, complaint, and status. Gold-fine textiles, horses, precious objects, brides, doctors, craftsmen, and messengers move between courts. A king may flatter another king as brother while quietly maneuvering against his interests. Prestige matters intensely. To be recognized as great king is to belong to an exclusive club of rulers who treat one another at least formally as peers. Hatti's membership in this world shows how far Hattusa has risen from its plateau setting. The city, hidden for centuries, was once part of an international system, sophisticated enough to manage peace rivalry and insult through carefully shaped words. Yet the empire behind the name is always more fragile than its royal language admits. Treaties threaten curses because loyalty breaks. Walls rise because enemies exist. Archives preserve obligations because memory is unreliable. Armies march because authority at a distance weakens if not repeatedly displayed. Hattusa stands at the center of this entire web, drawing in reports and sending out commands, but the web is stretched across mountains, plains, river corridors, foreign courts and restless frontiers. Its strength is real, its reach is impressive, but no empire made from so many promises, fears and moving parts can ever be completely still. In Hattusa, power does not belong only to kings' armies, treaties and walls. It also belongs to gods, and the city's sacred life is so deeply woven into its political existence that the two cannot be separated without distorting both. The capital is not merely a place where rulers happen to worship. It is a ritual engine, a landscape of temples, festivals, offerings, purification rites, sacred roads, and divine obligations. The Hittite kingdom is often described as the land of 1,000 gods, and while that phrase simplifies a complex religious world, it captures something true about Hattusa's atmosphere. The city gathers deities from many regions, traditions, and languages, then places them under the supervision of the royal court. To rule Hatti is not only to command people, it is to manage a crowded divine world that can bless the kingdom, abandon it, punish it, or demand attention at the worst possible moment. The sacred geography of Hattusa begins with the city itself. Its temples are not decorative additions placed around a political center. They are part of the reason the capital exists as a capital. The great temple in the lower city stands as one of the clearest signs of this. Its courtyard, storerooms, and sanctuary spaces show that worship is organized, resourced, and administered on a large scale. The deities most often associated with this central cult are the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Arina figures, whose importance reaches into the heart of Hittite kingship. The storm god brings power, weather, fertility, and royal legitimacy. The sun goddess of Arina carries a majesty that links divine oversight with the life of the kingdom. The details of their worship are not completely recoverable, and scholars still debate the development of particular cults across Hittite history, but their place in royal ideology is unmistakable. The Hittite king's religious role is demanding. He is not a distant secular ruler who occasionally attends ceremonies for public appearance. He is a ritual participant whose correct action helps maintain the relationship between the human and divine realms. Festivals require his presence or the presence of those acting in his name. Offerings must be made. Sacred journeys must be performed. Gods must be honored in proper sequence. Ritual failures can matter because they are not imagined as private mistakes. They can threaten the order of the land. This gives Hattusa an unusual rhythm. Its calendar is not only agricultural or administrative, it is ceremonial, filled with obligations that move people, animals, objects, food, music, and royal attention through sacred space. The number of temples in the upper city is one of the striking features of Hattusa. Their presence suggests not simply a pious population, but a capital that has gathered many local and regional cults into one imperial setting. Some of these temples are modest compared with the Great Temple, but together they create the impression of a city where divine residences multiply across the slopes. Each temple requires care. Each god or goddess has needs, traditions, and connections to particular communities. By bringing these cults into the capital, the Hittite state symbolically brings the land itself into Hattusa. A deity from a local town is not merely a religious figure. That deity is tied to the loyalty, identity, and protection of a place. To honor the god is also to acknowledge the region. To neglect the god may risk more than divine irritation. It may signal political disorder. A lesser-known and fascinating detail of Hittite religion is its habit of collecting rather than erasing. Conquered or incorporated regions do not always lose their gods to a single official pantheon. Instead, the Hittite world often absorbs divine names, rituals and traditions, preserving them in texts and ceremonies. Hattian, Hurrian, Luwian, Syrian and Mesopotamian elements can appear in the religious life preserved at Hattusa. This creates a sacred archive as layered as the political empire itself. The result can seem bewildering: gods with overlapping roles, local forms, foreign names, and rituals that require specialists from particular traditions. Yet this complexity is not accidental chaos. It is a method of rule. The empire holds diversity by recording it, performing it, and placing it within royal responsibility. Beyond the city walls, the sanctuary of Yazilikaya gives Hattusa's sacred world one of its most haunting surviving forms. Set among natural rock outcrops not far from the capital, it is a place where carved reliefs of deities move across stone surfaces in solemn procession. The sanctuary likely has connections with the major royal and religious ceremonies, though its full meaning remains debated. The rock itself matters. This is not a temple built entirely apart from nature. It is a sacred arrangement using natural chambers, cliffs and carved figures to bring divine presence into the landscape. The processions of gods and goddesses, the weathered reliefs, the royal imagery and the setting between stone walls make Yazilikaya feel like a meeting point between architecture, mountain and cosmic order. The gods carved there include figures associated with the Hurrian-influence pantheon, reflecting the growing importance of Hurrian religious elements in the later Hittite imperial period. This does not mean Hittite religion simply becomes Hurrian or abandons older traditions. It means that the royal cult continues to evolve, absorbing powerful forms that help express kingship and cosmic hierarchy. Such religious adaptation mirrors the political world of the empire. Hatti survives by incorporating. It takes in foreign scribal habits, diplomatic conventions, regional gods and mythic traditions, then reorders them around the capital. Hattusa becomes a place where the sacred map of many lands is compressed into one royal landscape. Ritual texts show how anxious and exacting this sacred world can be. There are rituals for purification, for appeasing angry gods, for countering bad omens, for healing, for military danger, for broken oaths, for royal troubles, and for restoring balance when something has gone wrong. Some rituals use substitute objects, animal symbolic transfers or elaborate sequences of movement and offering. To modernize, these procedures may seem strange, but they belong to a world where misfortune often requires explanation beyond visible cause. A failed harvest, illness in the royal family, plague in the army, or defeat at the frontier can all suggest that divine order has been disturbed. The evidence remains incomplete, but the surviving texts show a society determined to respond to uncertainty through disciplined sacred action. This religious anxiety has practical effects. If the gods must be honored in many places, the king and court must travel, organize supply and schedule. Festivals can take the royal household away from the capital or bring participants into it. Roads become ritual paths. Storehouses support offerings. Scribes preserve festival sequences so they can be repeated correctly. Musicians, singers, priests, cooks, animal handlers, and ritual experts all become part of the machinery of sacred maintenance. The divine world, therefore, shapes labor movement and administration. It is not hidden inside belief alone. It leaves marks on architecture, food storage, animal management, textile production, and the calendar of the state. The spiritual life of Hattusa also reflects the insecurity of empire. A small village may honor its local gods and worry about local storm sickness and harvests. An imperial capital must worry on a larger scale. It must ask whether the gods of conquered regions are satisfied, whether oaths sworn by vassals remain effective, whether royal sins have angered divine powers, whether neglected rituals have opened the door to disaster. The more the empire expands, the more obligations it gathers. In that sense, Hattusa's 1,000 gods are not only a sign of religious richness, they are a burden. Every incorporated deity represents another relationship to maintain another possible source of favour, another possible danger if ignored. And yet there is beauty in this burden. The image of Hattusa as a mountain capital filled with gods gives the city a depth that walls and treaties alone cannot provide. Processions move through gates under the eyes of carved guardians. Offerings are carried into temple courts. Smoke rises into the hard plateau air. Priests recite old words whose languages may already feel ancient. Scribes copy rituals so that fragile memory can survive. At Yassilikaya, divine figures remain carved into rock, still advancing in silence, long after the kingdom that honoured them has vanished. The city's sacred landscape reveals a civilization trying to hold the world together through attention to gods, seasons, ancestors, enemies, oaths, and signs. When Hattusa later falls silent, this sacred system collapses with the political one. Temples lose their daily offerings, festival roads empty. The gods gathered from many lands are no longer maintained by royal command. But the stones remember the shape of devotion. The temples remain as foundations. The reliefs remain in weathered procession. The tablets remain with their instructions for rites no one performs. The ancient capital that went unrecognized for centuries was not only the seat of a forgotten empire, it was a city crowded with divine presences built on the belief that history itself could turn on whether the proper offering reached the proper god at the proper time. The struggle between Hatti and Egypt reaches its most famous shape on the plains around Kadesh, a city whose name becomes far more widely remembered than Hattusa itself. Kadesh stands in Syria near routes that matter to merchants, armies, envoys, and kings. Whoever controls such places does not simply possess a dot on a map. He controls access, allegiance, prestige, and the movement of influence between worlds. For Egypt, the northern lands beyond Canaan are a stage on which pharaohs display reach and divine favour. For Hatti, they are the southern edge of imperial power, a frontier where vassals must be held and rivals must be checked. The battle that unfolds there in the 13th century before the Common Era is often remembered through Egyptian monuments, where Ramesses II presents himself in grand heroic form. Yet behind that famous Egyptian image stands the Hittite king Muwatalli II, the armies of Hatti, and the far inland capital whose power has drawn Egypt into confrontation. Kadesh does not begin as a sudden clash between strangers. It emerges from decades of rivalry over Syria. Cities in the region often survive by shifting between greater powers, calculating which king is more dangerous, more generous, or more likely to arrive with an army. The loyalty of a vassal ruler can become the spark for international crisis. In this world, a city's decision may look like treachery to one empire and prudence to another. Hatti and Egypt both understand that if one power appears weak, the political fabric of the region can unravel quickly. A vassal may defect. A border may shift. A rival may claim legitimacy. What happens at Kadesh is therefore not only military, it is a test of imperial credibility. Ramesses II marches north with the confidence of a pharaoh determined to restore and display Egyptian authority. Egyptian accounts present the campaign in dramatic terms, especially the moment when Ramesses is said to have faced great danger and personally turned disaster into triumph. These accounts are invaluable, but they are also royal propaganda shaped to magnify the pharaoh's glory. The Hittite side of the story survives less fully in narrative form, and the evidence remains incomplete. This imbalance has affected memory for centuries. The battle becomes famous largely because Egypt carved and copied its version on temple walls, while Hattusa's role waits more quietly in archives treaties and the reconstructed political context. Once again, visibility shapes recognition. The Hittite army at Kadesh is not a minor force. Muwatalli gathers troops from the core of Hatti and from allied and vassal lands. This coalition reflects the empire's structure, not a single people marching alone, but a network of obligations brought into military form. Chariots, infantry commanders, and contingents from different regions converge under Hittite leadership. The army's size in ancient accounts is difficult to accept literally, because royal records often inflate numbers, and scholars still debate the scale of the forces involved. But even cautious estimates recognize that the battle is a major confrontation between two of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. The logistical demands alone are immense. Horses must be fed, chariots maintained, troops supplied, messages sent, terrain understood, deception used. Deception plays a famous role in the Egyptian telling. Rameses receives misleading information, suggesting that the Hittite army is far away when in fact it is hidden nearby. This allows the Hittites to strike the Egyptian forces before they are fully concentrated. The image is vivid, an army stretched along the road, divisions separated, confidence giving way to sudden danger, chariots surging from concealment, dust rising across the plain. Whether every detail of the Egyptian account is precise or shaped for drama, the tactical situation suggests that Muwatalli and his commanders understand the value of timing. Hittite power here is not crude. It is organized, patient, and capable of exploiting Egyptian vulnerability. The battle itself is difficult to reconstruct in full. Egyptian reliefs and inscriptions emphasize Ramesses' personal courage and eventual success. Modern historians often treat the outcome more cautiously. It does not appear to have been the decisive Egyptian victory that Ramesses' monuments suggest. Hatti retains influence in the region, and Kadesh does not become a permanent Egyptian prize. The result may best be understood as a brutal, costly confrontation that allows both sides to claim something while neither fully destroys the other. No single explanation fully accounts for the battle's later fame, except the unusual survival and repetition of the Egyptian version. In military terms, it's a clash of giants that ends in ambiguity. In memory, it becomes a monument to the power of royal storytelling. For Hattusa, the significance is enormous. The capital on the Anatolian plateau stands behind the Hittite presence at Kadesh, even if its walls are far from the battlefield. Every treaty, vassal obligation, chariot-fitting royal command, stored ration and diplomatic calculation that supports the campaign belongs in some way to the system centered at Hattusa. The battle shows the reach of that system. A king ruling from an inland Anatolian city can confront Egypt in Syria and prevent pharaonic power from simply reclaiming the region. This alone should have secured Hattusa a permanent place in popular historical memory. Yet, the opposite happens. Egypt's stone monuments broadcast one version of the battle across time while the Hittite capital falls into obscurity. There is a quiet irony in this. The battle helps preserve the Hittites in the records of their rival. Egypt's boasts, even when self-serving, acknowledge that Hatti is a power worthy of confrontation. A pharaoh does not need to dramatize victory over an insignificant enemy. The scale of Egyptian royal display hints at the seriousness of the threat. In trying to magnify Ramesses, the monuments also preserve the shadow of Muwatalli. They reveal a world in which Egypt is not alone at the summit of power, but forced to contend with another kingdom whose capital many later generations will fail to identify. The aftermath is as important as the battle. Over time, the rivalry between Hatti and Egypt gives way to diplomacy, culminating in the famous peace treaty between Hattusili III and Rameses II. This treaty, known from both Egyptian and Hittite versions, is often described as one of the earliest surviving international peace agreements between great powers. It does not arise from sentimental harmony, it reflects calculation. Both kingdoms have reasons to stabilize their relationship. Assyria's rise, Syrian politics, dynastic needs, and the exhaustion of repeated conflict all help shape the diplomatic turn. Peace in this world is not the absence of ambition. It is ambition managed through oath marriage and mutual recognition. The treaty reveals the sophistication of late Bronze Age diplomacy. It invokes gods as witnesses, establishes obligations of friendship and assistance, and addresses issues such as fugitives and mutual support. Later, royal marriage strengthens the relationship when a Hittite princess is sent to Egypt as a wife for Rameses. These acts do not erase rivalry, but they reshape it. Great kings can fight, then call one another brother. They can spill blood over Syrian cities, then exchange gifts and formal promises. The ancient world is often imagined as simpler than the modern one, but the diplomacy around Hatti and Egypt shows a political language of striking complexity. Hattus's archives make this world visible from the Hittite side. They show that the city is not merely reacting to Egyptian greatness. It is participating in a shared international order where status must be carefully maintained. The Hittite king expects recognition as an equal, not as a lesser mountain ruler at the edge of civilization. The capital's scribes preserve the formal language of this equality. Clay tablets in Hattusa hold what stone temples in Egypt proclaim differently. Between them lies the tension of memory. One civilization carves its heroic image for public eternity, while the other stores diplomatic reality in archives that must be excavated and deciphered thousands of years later. Kadesh therefore changes memory in two ways. It confirms Hatti's place among the great powers of the age, and it also shows how easily the memory of one side can dominate when its monuments remain more legible. The battle becomes famous, but the capital behind one of the armies remains unrecognized for centuries. Hattusa shapes events that echo through Egyptian temples, yet its own name fades from the living landscape. The city's power reaches far enough to challenge Rameses, but not far enough to prevent historical forgetting. Still, in the long story of the ancient capital, Kadesh matters because it gives scale to everything already seen. The walls of Hattusa are not provincial defences. The tablets are not local records. The temples are not isolated shrines. They belong to a kingdom capable of standing in the front rank of late Bronze Age politics. The wind moving over the ruins today crosses a place that once helped decide the fate of Syrian cities and the ambitions of Egypt's most famous warrior pharaoh. What was forgotten was not small. It was a capital whose influence stretched into one of the most celebrated battles of the ancient world, then vanished so thoroughly from recognition that its stones had to wait in silence for history to find its way back. Beneath the image of Hittite power beneath the gates, treaties, armies, and sacred processions, pressure is always accumulating. The empire that reaches from the Anatolian plateau towards Syria is impressive, but it is also difficult to hold together. Its strength depends on roads remaining open, vassals remaining loyal, harvests remaining sufficient, royal succession remaining stable, and rival powers remaining manageable. None of these conditions is guaranteed. By the later 13th century, before the Common Era, the world around Hattusa is growing more unstable, not because one single disaster suddenly appears from nowhere, but because many strains begin to pull at the same system. This is often how great powers weaken. They do not always fall at the first blow. They become less able to absorb the blows that once could have been survived. The Hittite Empire is especially vulnerable to the problem of distance. Hattusa is a powerful capital, but it is inland and elevated far from many of the contested regions that give the empire wealth and prestige. Orders can be written, sealed, and sent, but messages still depend on human and animal movement across difficult landscapes. Armies can march, but they consume supplies as they move. Vassal rulers can swear loyalty, but oaths do not prevent ambition when the central court looks distracted. A royal command leaving Hattusa may be authoritative in principle, yet by the time it reaches a frontier city, the local situation may already have changed. The empire is held together by communication, and communication in the Late Bronze Age is always slower than danger. Northern pressure remains a persistent concern. Hittite records often mention the Kaska groups associated with the northern regions beyond the secure heartland. They appear not as one easily defined kingdom with a single capital, but as a recurring threat that disrupts Hittite control raids territory and sometimes forces military response. Scholars still debate the social organization and precise movements of the Kaska, partly because the evidence comes largely through Hittite eyes. Yet their impact on the Hittite state is clear enough. They represent a form of danger that is hard to eliminate permanently. A great army may defeat an enemy in a campaign, but mountainous or difficult frontier zones can continue producing instability year after year. For Hattusa, this matters deeply because the northern threat is not comfortably far away. It presses against the Anatolian core. The west also refuses to remain simple. Lands such as Azawa and related western Anatolian polities challenge Hittite authority at different times, while the shadowy presence of Ahiawa complicates the picture. Whether Ahiawa refers directly to Mycenaean Greek power or to a broader Aegean-linked political world remains a matter of scholarly debate, but the texts suggest that Hatti has to pay attention to rulers and conflicts beyond the central plateau. Western Anatolia is a region of shifting loyalties, local ambitions, and difficult geography. Campaigns there cost effort. Diplomatic mistakes can create long-term problems. The Hittite king may claim supremacy, but supremacy has to be maintained repeatedly, and repetition itself is a sign of strain. To the east, Assyria's rise changes the balance. Assyria is not merely another neighbour. It becomes an increasingly assertive power capable of challenging Hittite interests in northern Mesopotamia and Syria. As Assyria expands, the Hittite world faces the danger of losing influence in regions that are vital to its international standing. The struggle is not always direct and simple, but it adds pressure to an already complicated imperial system. Hatti cannot focus all its energy in one direction. It must look north, west, south, and east, while also managing the royal house, the temples, the harvest, and the loyalty of its own officials. Succession disputes and dynastic tensions weaken the empire from within. Hittite history contains episodes of royal murder, contested legitimacy, exile, restoration, and uneasy family politics. The throne is not just a seat, it is a prize surrounded by relatives, factions, military interests, and divine expectations. A king who comes to power under controversial circumstances may spend years reinforcing his legitimacy through prayer treaty construction and political maneuver. This does not mean every reign is chaotic, but it does mean the royal family is both the centre of stability and a recurring source of danger. The empire depends on the house of the king, and the house of the king is made of human beings with ambitions, grievances, fears, and claims. Climate and food supply add another layer quieter than war, but potentially more devastating. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean experiences periods of stress, and many scholars consider drought crop failure or broader climatic instability as part of the background to the age's collapses. The evidence remains debated, and no single climate explanation fully accounts for the fall of Hattusa or the wider crisis. Still, a capital like Hattusa depends on agricultural production from a challenging environment. Grain must be collected and stored, animals must be maintained, workers, soldiers, priests and royal households must be fed. If harvests become unreliable over several years, the pressure spreads through every level of the state. Storehouses empty faster, vassals become harder to control, armies become more expensive to move. Ritual anxiety deepens because famine is never only material in the Hittite imagination. It is also a sign that divine order may be disturbed. Trade disruption may have deepened the crisis. The late Bronze Age world is interconnected through the movement of metals, luxury goods, textiles, timber grain, and diplomatic gifts. Bronze itself depends on copper and tin often travels long distances through complex exchange networks. Palaces and courts thrive on controlled access to such materials. If routes become unsafe, if coastal systems weaken, if rival powers interrupt supplies, or if local unrest breaks the chain, elites feel the consequences quickly. The Hittite state is inland but not isolated. Its chariots, weapons, rituals, diplomacy and prestige all depend on materials and connections reaching beyond the plateau. When the wider world trembles, Hattusa trembles with it. Plague may also have played a role in earlier periods of Hittite weakness. Hittite texts preserve prayers connected with epidemic disease, including royal appeals that describe suffering after plague enters the land. These belong to a specific historical context before the final collapse, but they reveal how disease could be understood as both a practical catastrophe and a divine judgment. A plague does not simply kill people. It disrupts labor, military strength, ritual continuity, royal confidence, and trust in the favor of the gods. Even if epidemic disease is not the central explanation for Hattusa's final abandonment, the record shows that the Hittite state had already known how invisible forces could weaken visible power. The burden of ritual obligation may itself become heavier under stress. As danger increases, the court must ask which god has been offended, which oath broken, which festival neglected, which impurity left unresolved. Ritual action can reassure a society, but it also requires resources, time, and attention. In a stable period, a calendar full of ceremonies displays royal control. In a crisis, the same calendar may reveal how many obligations the king must fulfill, while enemies move and supplies diminish. This does not mean religion causes collapse. It means the sacred and political systems are so closely tied that strain in one echoes through the other. What makes the weakening of Hatti so difficult to explain is that each factor alone feels insufficient. Frontier pressure does not automatically destroy a great kingdom. Drought does not always end an empire. Succession trouble can be survived. Trade disruption can be managed if other systems remain strong. Rival powers can be contained when the center is confident. But when these pressures overlap, the empire's ability to recover begins to thin. The state becomes like a wall with many small cracks. One crack can be repaired. A dozen cracks spreading through stone already underweight become something else. Hattusa, at the center of this system, must have felt the change before the end became visible. Perhaps officials notice shortages in stores. Perhaps messengers arrive with worse news from the frontiers. Perhaps rituals multiply in response to omens, illness, or fear. Perhaps royal commands become sharper because obedience is less certain. Perhaps ordinary people feel the pressure first through grain labor demands military levies or rumors carried through the gates. Archaeology cannot recover every anxious conversation, and no surviving text gives a simple diary of the capital's final decline. Yet the pattern of the wider world suggests that the city is not destroyed in a vacuum. It belongs to a collapsing network of power. This is the deeper turn in the story. Hattusa has been built to gather command and protect. Its walls resist enemies. Its archives preserve obligations. Its temples maintain divine order. Its treaties bind vassals and rivals. But the very complexity that makes the capital powerful also makes it vulnerable. A simple village can endure by shrinking. An empire must keep many systems alive at once. When roads fail, when harvests falter, when loyalty weakens, when rivals press, when the gods seem restless, the capital cannot easily become small again. It must either continue as the centre, or face the terrifying possibility that the world it holds together no longer holds. The end of Hattusa does not arrive in the record as a single clear moment frozen with the certainty of a dated inscription. It comes instead through damage, abandonment, burned buildings, emptied spaces, and the uneasy silence that follows when a capital no longer functions as a capital. Archaeology shows destruction in parts of the city, but destruction alone does not explain everything. Fire can mark invasion, accident clearing ritual closure, or collapse after evacuation. Empty rooms can suggest panic, but they can also suggest planned departure. Broken tablets may point to disaster, but also to the ordinary violence of roofs, falling shelves, decaying, and centuries pressing down on clay. The fall of Hattusa is therefore not a neat scene of flames and screams, even if fire belongs to the story. It is a historical problem made from traces that refuse to form one simple picture. By the early 12th century, before the Common Era, the Hittite imperial system appears to have unravelled. The capital that once sent commands across Anatolia and Syria loses its role. The royal court vanishes from Hattusa. The archive stops growing. The temples cease to function as imperial religious institutions. The walls remain, but walls without a state become monuments to a power that can no longer command the labour needed to maintain them. Scholars still debate how sudden the final abandonment was, how much of the population left before destruction, and whether the city was attacked by enemies deserted under pressure, deliberately evacuated, or affected by several processes at once. What survives in the record suggests not a single clean death, but the disintegration of an entire political world. One striking feature of Hattusa's final phase is the possibility that parts of the city were already being emptied before the most visible destruction occurred. Some evidence has been interpreted to suggest that valuable portable goods were removed from certain buildings, and that the royal administration may have withdrawn in an organized way rather than being entirely caught by surprise. This remains debated, and caution is necessary, but it complicates the older image of a capital simply overwhelmed in one violent assault. If officials, priests, soldiers, or royal personnel left before the final fires, then the silence of Hattusa may have begun not with an enemy at the gate, but with decisions made inside the palace system itself. A capital can die when the king leaves even before the walls are breached. The idea of evacuation is haunting because it changes the emotional shape of the end. Instead of imagining only chaos, one must imagine sorting, selecting, and abandoning. Which tablets are worth carrying? Which statues, vessels, seals, weapons, textiles, and ritual objects can be moved? Which must be left behind because the roads are unsafe? Animals are limited. Time is short, or the future destination is uncertain. The great systems of Hattusa, once designed to preserve order, may have been reduced to desperate choices. Storerooms that once measured abundance become places of removal. Sacred objects that once anchored divine presence may be packed for travel. Archives that once promised memory may be left to the mercy of fire and falling roofs. Yet fire is there. Burned layers in parts of the city show that destruction did occur and some areas suffered severely. Flames would have moved differently through stone foundations, mud brick walls, wooden beams, roofing material, stored goods, and dry debris. In a city built partly with perishable superstructures, fire could transform buildings, quickly collapsing roofs and baking clay tablets, harder than ordinary drying ever could. This is one of history's strange accidents. Destruction helps preserve evidence. The same heat that marks catastrophe can make tablets survive long enough for modern scholars to read them. Hattusa's final fires, whatever caused them, become unwilling archivists. The possible attackers remain uncertain. The broader Eastern Mediterranean world around this time experiences upheaval, often associated with the so-called Sea Peoples migrations raids, internal rebellions, and the collapse or weakening of palace states. But linking Hattusa's fall directly to one famous wave of invaders is too simple. The city is inland and its problems are rooted in Anatolian and imperial dynamics as much as in Mediterranean disruption. Northern groups such as the Kaska may have taken advantage of Hittite weakness. Internal revolt, famine, loss of central authority, or regional fragmentation may have opened the way for destruction. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. The fall likely belongs to the wider Late Bronze Age collapse, but Hattusa's particular end must be understood through its own geography and political fragility. The collapse of the capital does not mean every Hittite tradition disappears instantly. This is another important distinction. The empire falls, but people continue living across Anatolia and northern Syria. In the south, especially in places such as Karkemish and other Neo-Hittite or Syro-Anatolian states, elements of Hittite royal culture, language, traditions, iconography and political identity continue in altered forms for centuries. The imperial center dies, but fragments of its world survive elsewhere. This makes Hattusa's abandonment even more dramatic. The capital is not forgotten because every descendant vanishes. It is forgotten because the specific imperial system that made Hattusa meaningful no longer controls memory from that place. Inside the city, the end would have transformed sacred geography into emptiness. Temples that once required offerings and staff would stand unused. If divine statues or cult objects were removed, the buildings would become shells. If some were left behind, they would be vulnerable to looting damage or neglect. Ritual roads would lose their processions. The great temple storerooms would no longer receive goods for the gods. At Yazilikaya, the carved divine processions would remain in stone, but the living ceremonies that gave them force would fade. The gods of the capital, once gathered by royal care, would be scattered into memory text and ruin. For ordinary inhabitants, the end may have been uneven. Some may have left early with officials or households attached to the palace. Some may have remained until insecurity, hunger, or violence forced departure. Some may have returned later to salvage materials, occupy small areas, or use the ruins in ways unrelated to their imperial past. Archaeology often reveals such complexity at abandoned capitals. A city does not become empty in exactly the same way everywhere. One neighborhood may burn, another may be stripped, another may decay slowly. Later, people may move through the ruins without seeing them as the center of a vanished world. The capital becomes a resource, a danger, a shelter, a quarry, a landmark, or a place of stories. The most difficult thing to recover is the final human perception of the fall. Did those leaving Hattusa believe the abandonment was temporary? Did they expect to return after a campaign, a famine, or a crisis passed? Did priests fear that the gods had withdrawn, or did they carry the gods with them? Did scribes know that the archive was ending? The evidence remains incomplete, and these questions cannot be answered with certainty. Yet the silence of the site invites them, because Hattusa was not an abstract structure. It was inhabited by people whose lives were tied to the continuation of royal power. When that continuation failed, their world did not merely change politically. It changed cosmologically, economically, socially, and emotionally. After the fires, after the departures, after the last official orders stop being issued, the plateau begins its long work of erasure. Mud brick melts into mounds, timber rots, roofs fall, stones loosen, snow enters rooms, seeds take root, animals cross courtyards. The city's once careful boundaries soften. Gates remain, but they no longer regulate an imperial world. Walls remain, but they defend no king. Tablets remain, but no scribe retrieves them. The capital has not disappeared physically, but its systems have died, and without those systems the ruins become increasingly unreadable. This is the moment when Hattusa begins its second life, not as a capital, but as a mystery waiting to be misunderstood. Its fall is not only the end of Hittite imperial rule from the city, it is the beginning of centuries in which the place will be seen without being recognized. The empire's heart stops beating, but the body of stone remains on the plateau, weathering slowly under the same sky that once watched royal processions pass through guarded gates. The silence that follows is vast, and it lasts far longer than the empire itself. After Hattusa falls silent, the ruins do not vanish from the earth. They remain in the open, exposed to weather and human passing, but recognition drains away from them. This is one of the strangest fates a city can suffer. Total destruction leaves nothing to puzzle over. Complete burial hides a place until excavation restores it. Hattusa endures in a more unsettling condition, visible but unnamed, present but disconnected from the civilization that built it. The walls still trace the ridges, the gates still hold their carved guardians, the rocky sanctuary still preserves its solemn processions. Yet the chain of memory breaks. The people who later move through the region may know the stones are ancient, but knowing that something is old is not the same as knowing what it once meant. Across the centuries after the Hittite imperial collapse, Anatolia does not become empty. New powers, cultures, languages, and communities move through and settle across the land. Phrygians, Persians, Hellenistic kingdoms, Romans, Byzantines, Seljuks, Ottomans, and countless local societies all leave their marks in different ways. Roads are reused or abandoned, villages shift, fortresses rise elsewhere. Old stones may be repurposed, avoided, admired, or simply absorbed into the background of rural life. In such a crowded historical landscape, the ruins of Hattusa become one ancient presence among many. Without readable inscriptions in a known language, without a living priesthood, without a royal line claiming descent from the place, its identity grows faint. This is not unusual in the ancient world, but Hattusa makes the process especially dramatic because of its former importance. A capital that once negotiated with Egypt and ruled over vassal kingdoms becomes in later memory a collection of impressive but uncertain remains. The city is not protected by continuous fame. Egypt's monuments remain tied to names still repeated by Greek and Roman writers. Classical cities often remain connected to later literary traditions. Biblical geography preserves some Near Eastern names in religious memory. Hattusa, however, belongs to a civilization whose language, political structure, and imperial identity vanish from common knowledge. The evidence remains physically present, but the interpretive key is lost. Local names and impressions survive, as they often do around ruins. The modern village name Boğazköy, later Boğazkale, belongs to the more recent landscape, not to the Hittite city's self-understanding. Travellers and villagers may notice the remains and assign meanings shaped by their own worlds. A gate with strange figures may become a curiosity. Large walls may be attributed to some vague ancient race, to legendary builders, or to a people known from other histories. This is how ruins live when documents cannot speak. They become containers for partial recognition. Their size is acknowledged, but their story is supplied by guesswork. Early outside visitors to the region encounter the remains with limited tools for understanding them. In the 19th century, European travellers and explorers begin documenting many ancient sites across Anatolia and the Near East, often with a mixture of genuine curiosity, imperial ambition, biblical expectation, and classical bias. They are searching for known names, cities mentioned by Greek authors, places connected to scripture, traces of civilizations already recognized by European scholarship. Hattusa does not fit easily into those categories at first. The ruins are impressive, but the Hittites themselves have not yet fully emerged as the great imperial power that archaeology will later reveal. The site, therefore, waits in a zone of uncertainty. One reason for this misrecognition is that the Hittites are known before they are understood. Their name appears in ancient texts outside Anatolia, including biblical references and Egyptian records. But for a long time, these references do not form a clear picture of a major empire centered in central Anatolia. Some scholars once imagined the Hittites as a minor people, or a group known only at the margins of greater civilizations. The idea that they possessed a vast capital, a powerful state, a sophisticated archive, and a major role in late Bronze Age diplomacy had to be built slowly from evidence. Hattusa's ruins were waiting for a historical category large enough to receive them. The physical appearance of the site may have contributed to the delay. Hattusa is monumental, but it does not present itself in the familiar visual language that early observers were trained to value. It has no standing columns like a classical city, no pyramids, no towering ziggurat, no vast still intact temple facade covered in legible scenes. Its greatness is distributed across walls, gates, foundations, tablets, and landscape planning. To understand it requires walking the terrain, mapping the defences, excavating archives, comparing texts, and learning languages. The city does not surrender its meaning to a single glance. It demands a slower form of recognition, and for centuries no one brings the necessary combination of questions and evidence. The carvings at Yazilikaya and the city gates offer clues, but clues are not the same as answers. The figures are powerful and strange, yet without a deciphered context they resist identification. Are they gods, kings, warriors, guardians, symbols from a lost cult, or remnants of a people known by another name? Scholars still debate some details even now, but before the Hittite archive is understood, the uncertainty is far greater. The carved processions at Yazilikaya remain like a sentence in a language no one can read. Their order suggests meaning, their repetition suggests ritual, their survival suggests importance. But the story behind them lies out of reach. There is also a broader habit in historical memory that works against Hattusa. Civilizations with dramatic stone monuments and later literary champions tend to dominate the imagination. Those whose records are buried, whose architecture is less instantly iconic, or whose languages require difficult decipherment can seem less important until scholarship restores their scale. This does not mean Hattusa is objectively less impressive. It means that recognition depends on what later ages are prepared to notice. For a long time, the ancient capital is not invisible because it is small. It is invisible because the mental map of ancient history has not made room for it. The land itself deepens the obscurity. The high plateau preserves a kind of distance. Unlike cities continuously rebuilt into modern urban centres, Hattusa does not force daily life to confront its ancient identity in the same way. It lies apart, weathering in a rural landscape where ruins can become familiar without becoming understood. A villager may pass a stone many times and have no reason to imagine that kings once sent letters from nearby rooms to Egypt, Babylon, or Syria. Familiarity can dull wonder. A place seen every day as part of the land may not be seen as a world historical capital. Yet this period of misrecognition is not empty. It is part of Hattus's story because it shows how fragile historical identity can be. The ruins retain matter but lose name. They retain form but lose function. They retain sacred images but lose worship. They retain archives but lose readers. The capital becomes a body without a voice, and later generations must decide what kind of body they are looking at. Some guesses come close, others miss entirely. The evidence waits beneath feet, under soil, inside broken rooms, and behind signs that no one can yet interpret. When modern archaeology finally begins to approach the site with the right questions, it does not discover a hidden city in the simplest sense. It discovers that the visible ruins have been underestimated. The revelation is not that stones exist. People knew that. The revelation is what the stones mean. The walls become imperial defences. The temples become the sacred architecture of the Hittite state. The tablets become a royal archive. The strange figures become part of a religious and political world. The anonymous ruin becomes Hattusa again. These centuries of misrecognition leave a warning that reaches beyond one city. History is not only lost when evidence disappears, it is also lost when evidence remains but cannot be connected, read, or believed. Hattusa stands through long ages as proof that the past can be present and still unknown. Its stones hold their place on the plateau, but without language, memory, and patient investigation, even a capital of kings can become a nameless arrangement of walls under the wind. The return of Hattusa to history begins not with a single triumphant revelation, but with a slow tightening of clues. 19th century travellers and scholars had seen the ruins, copied reliefs, described walls, and sensed that the site mattered. Yet importance alone was not identity. The old capital needed its name restored, and names in ancient history often return only when stones, inscriptions, language, and comparison begin to support one another. Hattusa's rediscovery is therefore a story of patient recognition. The land had preserved the body of the city. The tablets would restore its voice. But first, modern observers had to understand that the broken remains on the Anatolian plateau belonged not to some vague lost people, but to the centre of a kingdom powerful enough to stand beside Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and Mitanni in the great diplomatic world of the late Bronze Age. The process unfolds in stages. Explorers document the visible monuments. Reliefs at Yazilikaya draw attention because they are too deliberate and too strange to dismiss. The gates, walls, and carved figures suggest a sophisticated culture, but the question remains open. Across the Near East, meanwhile, scholars are wrestling with texts that mention a people called the Hittites. Egyptian records preserve the memory of conflict with Hatti. Biblical references keep the name alive in another form, though not in a way that clearly reveals an Anatolian empire. Cuneiform tablets from different regions begin to expand the picture. Still, the connection between these textual shadows and the plateau ruins has to be made carefully. Ancient history is full of tempting identifications, and many early theories fail because they move faster than the evidence allows. The decisive change comes with excavation. When archaeologists begin systematic work at Boğazköy in the early 20th century, the ground starts producing the archive that transforms uncertainty into recognition. Thousands of clay tablets and fragments emerge from the soil, many written in cuneiform. Some are broken, some are burned, some are preserved well enough to carry long passages of text. At first, even their presence is astonishing. A city with such an archive cannot be a minor ruin. It is a place of administration, royal ideology, religion, diplomacy, and law. The earth itself begins to contradict centuries of underestimation. The work is demanding and often unglamorous. Excavation does not simply mean finding treasures, it means mapping walls, recording layers, sorting fragments, cleaning tablets, comparing signs, identifying rooms, and slowly reconstructing context from damaged remains. A tablet pulled from the ground may be only part of a larger document. A fragment found in one place may belong to a text scattered by collapse. A building may have changed function over time. A burnt layer may mark destruction, but it must be interpreted with caution. The evidence remains incomplete at every turn, and yet the accumulation becomes overwhelming. Hattusa is not merely old, it is imperial. The decipherment of Hittite is one of the great intellectual moments in the city's return. The tablets are written largely in cuneiform, a script already known from Mesopotamian studies, but script is not the same as language. A familiar writing system can conceal an unfamiliar tongue. Scholars can recognize signs and still not understand the words they spell. Hittite eventually proves to be an Indo-European language, a discovery with consequences far beyond the history of one city. It expands understanding of the Indo-European language family and reveals a branch preserved in the archives of an Anatolian empire. This is one of the surprises hidden in Hattusa's clay, a language older in written form than Greek or Latin, belonging to a civilization that had long stood outside the familiar classical frame. Once the tablets begin to speak, the city changes. The ruins are no longer anonymous architecture. They become Hattusa, capital of the land of Hatti. Royal names appear, treaties can be read, rituals unfold in careful sequences, gods regain their titles. Laws reveal social categories. Diplomatic texts connect the plateau to Egypt and Syria. The famous peace treaty with Egypt is no longer only an Egyptian memory. The Hittite side takes its place. The city's archive does not merely add detail to an already secure story, it creates the story's framework. The Hittites move from the margins of ancient history into the center of late Bronze Age politics. This restoration also changes the interpretation of neighboring evidence. Egyptian scenes of Kadesh, once read mostly as monuments to Rameses, now belong to a wider political struggle in which Hatti is a true peer. References to Western Anatolia, Ahhiyawa, Mitanni, Assyria, Syria, and vassal kingdoms become part of a complicated international system. The tablets from Hattusa act like a missing set of coordinates. Once they are understood, many scattered pieces across the ancient Near East can be placed in relation to one another. A letter here, a treaty there, a carved relief elsewhere, a royal boast in another land all become more meaningful because the capital behind them has been found. A lesser-known but important aspect of the archive is that it reveals not only kings and battles but scribal habits. Colophons duplicate texts, training materials, and variations among copies show that Hattusa contains a living scribal culture, not just a pile of official records. Texts are copied, revised, collected, and sometimes organized according to palace or temple needs. Some tablets preserve older traditions in languages that may no longer have been spoken widely. Others show the practical concerns of administration. The scribes of Hattusa become unintentionally partners in their own rediscovery. They write for the needs of their age, but they leave enough behind for another age to reconstruct the world they served. The excavation also reveals the limits of text. It is tempting once tablets appear to imagine that writing solves the mystery completely. It does not. Texts must be interpreted, dated, compared, and placed into archaeological context. Royal documents exaggerate. Ritual texts preserve ideal procedures, not necessarily everyday practice. Laws may describe norms rather than actual outcomes. Diplomatic letters are shaped by status and strategy. Even when words survive, their meanings can remain slippery. Scholars still debate many details of Hittite political history, religious practice, population, urban organization, and collapse. Hattusa speaks, but it does not confess everything. Still, the change is profound. The site once seen as a strange ruin becomes a historical archive in stone and clay. Its walls are mapped as defensive systems. Its temples are understood as part of a sacred capital. Its gates are placed within a royal landscape of controlled movement. Yazilikaya is no longer only a mysterious rock sanctuary. It becomes part of the religious and dynastic world of the Hittite court. The city's rediscovery is not one discovery, but a series of recognitions reinforcing one another. Archaeology gives setting, philology gives language, comparative history gives connections. Together they restore a capital that had been present all along. There is a quiet drama in this kind of rediscovery. No army returns to reclaim the walls. No royal descendant arrives to reopen the gates. Instead, recognition comes through fragments lifted from dust and read by people who live in a world the Hittites could not have imagined. A broken tablet crosses more than 3,000 years of silence. A carved guardian at a gate becomes intelligible again. A name written in clay reconnects a ruin to an empire. The ancient capital no one recognized for centuries does not rise physically from the ground, because it was never entirely underground. It rises in the human mind where evidence slowly rearranges the map of the past. By the time Hattusa is restored to history, ancient civilization itself looks different. The Late Bronze Age is no longer a story dominated only by Egypt and Mesopotamia. Anatolia has its imperial voice. The high plateau becomes a center, not a margin. The forgotten city becomes proof that historical importance and later fame are not the same thing. Some civilizations are remembered because their monuments remain obvious. Others wait until language returns. Hattusa waits in stone, then in clay, then in scholarship until the city can finally be named again. Even after Hattusa is named again, even after its tablets are read and its walls are mapped, the city does not surrender all of its secrets. Rediscovery restores the ancient capital to history, but it also reveals how much has been damaged, removed, burned, scattered, or never written down in the first place. This is the fate of many archaeological revelations. At first, the evidence seems to solve the mystery. Then, as scholars look more closely, it creates deeper questions. Hattusa is no longer an anonymous ruin, yet it remains unfinished as a historical puzzle. Its stones speak, but not evenly. Its archives illuminate power, ritual, diplomacy, and law, while leaving other parts of life in shadow. Its final days become clearer in outline and more complicated in detail. The ancient capital is recognized again, but recognition is not the same as complete understanding. The most haunting uncertainty concerns the end. The fall of Hattusa can be placed within the wider crisis of the Late Bronze Age, but the exact sequence remains debated. Archaeology shows that parts of the city were destroyed by fire, yet the evidence does not point neatly to a single invading army storming the gates at one dramatic hour. Some buildings appear to have been emptied of valuable portable objects before the fires. This suggests that at least some people may have left in an organized way, perhaps taking important cult objects, administrative materials, or royal possessions with them. But who ordered the departure where they went, and whether they expected to return remain open questions. A capital can be abandoned under pressure without leaving a written explanation, especially when the very system that produces official records is collapsing. This possibility of planned withdrawal is one of the strangest parts of Hattusa's final story. If the royal court left, was it fleeing famine, military threat, political revolt, divine anger, or a combination of pressures? Did the king move to another centre temporarily hoping to preserve the state elsewhere? Did officials strip the palaces because they knew the city could no longer be held? Did priests remove divine images to protect them? Or had some cults already weakened before the final abandonment? The evidence remains incomplete. It is possible to imagine a hurried evacuation, but imagination cannot stand in for proof. Archaeology gives traces of absence, and absence is one of the hardest things to interpret. The royal burials present another mystery. For a capital of such importance, the location and character of Hittite royal tombs remain elusive. The kings of Hatti clearly possessed elaborate royal ideology, ancestral consciousness, and mortuary traditions, but the archaeological picture of their burials is far less visible than that of Egypt's pharaohs or some other ancient elites. This absence may reflect burial customs that do not leave the same kind of monumental trace. It may reflect destruction, looting undiscovered locations, or practices involving cremation and ancestor rituals that are difficult to identify archaeologically. Scholars still debate how Hittite royal death was handled in full. The missing tombs remind us that fame in archaeology often depends on what a culture chooses to build in durable form and what later conditions allow to survive. The city's population is another unresolved problem. Hattusa's walls enclose a large area, but enclosed space does not equal constant dense occupation. Some parts may have been used intensively only during certain periods. The upper city's temples and monumental zones may not have housed ordinary residents in the same way as domestic neighborhoods. The number of people living permanently inside the capital may have changed over time, swelling during festivals, campaigns, building projects, or moments of crisis. Estimates vary because the evidence is fragmentary. Houses do not survive as clearly as royal or sacred architecture. Temporary populations leave fainter traces than permanent ones. The capital's human scale therefore remains partly uncertain, even though its political scale is undeniable. There are also questions about how power actually moved through the city. The tablets preserve royal commands, treaties, rituals, laws, and administrative concerns, but they do not provide a complete map of daily governance. How many officials worked in the palace at any given time? How were archives organized in practice? Which tablets were consulted regularly and which were stored as formal memory? How did local elites from distant regions experience their visits to the capital? How did ordinary workers understand the imperial system that depended on their labor? The surviving record privileges, the concerns of kings, priests, and scribes. It opens a window, but the window looks out from the upper levels of society. The religious landscape too holds uncertainties. The Hittite world is famous for its many gods, yet the exact relationships among local cults state. Cults, imported deities and royal rituals are complex. A divine name in a text may not tell us how ordinary worshippers imagine that deity. A temple foundation may not reveal which rituals happened there across every period of use. Yazilikaya is especially powerful because its reliefs survive visibly, but its full ceremonial function remains debated. It may be connected to festivals, royal ancestor ideology, cosmic order, underworld symbolism, or several overlapping meanings. No single explanation fully accounts for all its features. The sanctuary remains one of those rare places where the evidence feels both abundant and resistant. The tablets themselves are full of gaps. Many are broken. Some survive only as fragments too small to restore confidently. Others are copies of older texts, raising questions about when a tradition began and how it changed. A ritual preserved in the archive may come from a region far from Hattusa. A myth may have been adapted through translation and scribal tradition. A treaty may preserve an official relationship, but not the private resentment behind it. Even when the words are readable, context can be missing. The archive is enormous, but it is not the whole voice of the civilization. It is what survived from particular institutions under particular conditions in a capital that burned and collapsed. One of the more intriguing unresolved issues is how Hittite identity itself should be understood. The empire's ruling language is Hittite, but the culture of Hatti is deeply mixed. Hattian Hurrian, Luwian, Akkadian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian elements all appear within the capital's written and religious life. The state calls itself the land of Hatti, using a name rooted in older Anatolian tradition. Its rulers govern over diverse peoples and regions. To call this world simply Hittite is useful, but it can also hide the layered nature of the society. Hattusa is not the capital of a single pure cultural block. It is the capital of an imperial formation that gathers, absorbs, translates, and reorganizes. That makes it richer but also harder to describe in simple terms. The wider collapse of the Late Bronze Age adds another layer of uncertainty. Hattusa falls during a period when many palace systems around the eastern Mediterranean and Near East suffer severe disruption. Mycenaean centres decline or collapse. Ugarit is destroyed. Egypt survives but weakens. Trade networks change. Populations move. Warfare, famine, internal unrest, and climate stress all appear in different combinations across the region. It is tempting to search for one master cause, but the evidence resists that simplicity. Hattusa's fall belongs to this larger pattern, yet it also has local causes rooted in Anatolia's frontiers, Hittite dynastic politics, and the capital's own vulnerabilities. The city is part of a regional storm, but it is not merely a leaf blown by distant winds. What Hattusa still withholds is therefore not a small set of missing facts. It withholds the lived texture of decision at the edge of collapse. It withholds the final thoughts of those who left the roots of the last royal household, the fate of many sacred objects, the exact chain of events that turned a functioning capital into ruins. It withholds the voices of servants, children, farmers, low-ranking soldiers, and many women whose labour supported the city, but whose names rarely entered durable records. It withholds the tone of fear in a room where officials realise the old system might not survive. And yet this withholding is part of why Hattusa remains so compelling. A completely solved past becomes static. An incomplete one continues to move. The city's recognised identity gives enough structure to understand its greatness, while its silences keep the listener close to the edge of discovery. Every wall tablet, gate, and burned room belongs to a known capital, but also to an unanswered question. The ancient city no one recognised for centuries is now recognised, studied, protected, and mapped, yet it remains in the deepest sense unfinished. Its mystery has changed shape. It is no longer the mystery of what the ruins are. It is the mystery of everything that happened inside them and vanished just before the record could catch it. Hattusa's return to recognition changes more than the story of one ruined city. It alters the shape of the ancient world around it. Once the capital is understood, the Hittites can no longer remain a faint people at the edge of better-known civilizations. They become what they were in their own age, one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, rulers of a difficult empire, rivals and partners of Egypt, heirs to older Anatolian traditions, borrowers from Mesopotamia, negotiators with Syria, watchers of Assyria, and builders of a mountain capital whose importance had been hidden not by complete destruction, but by centuries of misreading. Hattusa proves that the map of history is not fixed. It can be redrawn when a language is deciphered, when a tablet is read, when a gate is understood, when a forgotten name is placed back upon the stones that once carried it. The city's legacy begins with the archive. Through the tablets of Hattusa, the Hittite world enters historical memory in its own words, even if those words are damaged partial and shaped by royal institutions. Without them, the kingdom might still be known mainly through Egyptian boasts, biblical echoes, scattered inscriptions, and the archaeological remains of places whose meanings were not always clear. With them, Hatti becomes a speaking civilization. Its kings issue commands, defend their legitimacy, bind vassals, complain to gods, arrange peace recall campaigns, and preserve rituals in careful sequences. Its scribes reveal a court trained in multiple traditions. Its laws show a society concerned with order and compensation. Its myths and prayers reveal fear, imagination, and the search for divine balance. The archive does not make the Hittites familiar in every detail, but it makes them impossible to dismiss. Hattusa also changes the story of diplomacy. The peace treaty between Hatti and Egypt, preserved through both traditions, shows an international world that is more intricate than simple conquest. Great kings recognize one another, compete for prestige exchange, gifts, arrange marriages, demand fugitives, invoke gods, and turn war into formal relationship when necessity requires it. The Hittite capital stands behind that diplomacy. Its archives remind us that Bronze Age politics is not a primitive prelude to later statecraft. It already contains subtle language, legal obligation, status anxiety, and strategic restraint. A city forgotten for centuries helps reveal that international politics is ancient, sophisticated, and deeply human in its mixture of pride and fear. The legacy is architectural as well. The walls and gates of Hattusa show how Hittite builders transform landscape into power. They do not create a capital on a blank surface. They work with ridges, slopes, ravines, and heights, turning geology into defense and ceremony. The Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate, and the Great Rampart at Yerkapi reveal a civilization that understands how stone can guide emotion. Visitors are not merely admitted. They are impressed, warned, and placed within a hierarchy before they reach the inner spaces of the city. This legacy is quieter than the pyramids and less familiar than Greek temples, but it is no less deliberate. Hattusa is an ancient lesson in how architecture can make authority feel inevitable. Its sacred legacy is equally profound. Hattusa is not the capital of a narrow religious system, but of a gathered divine world. The so-called 1,000 gods of Hatti reflect an empire that absorbs local, regional, and foreign traditions into a royal religious order. Temples multiply. Rituals are copied. Deities from different landscapes find places in the capital's sacred geography. At Yazilakaya, the divine procession still moves across stone, silent but not empty. The sanctuary's weathered figures remind the modern observer that Hittite religion is not a simple list of names. It is a living system once tied to weather, kingship, illness, harvest, war, oath, purification, and the terrifying possibility that the gods might withdraw their favour. The city also leaves a warning about collapse. Hattusa is not remembered only because it rose, but because it failed. Its end belongs to the larger unravelling of the Late Bronze Age, yet the details remain specific and unresolved. The fall of the Hittite capital shows how vulnerable complex systems can become when many pressures overlap. Frontier conflict, drought, succession, tension, trade, disruption, rival powers, internal strain, and ritual anxiety may each be survivable alone. Together they can weaken the centre until even great walls cannot preserve the world they enclose. Hattusa's ruins therefore speak to a truth far beyond Anatolia. Civilizations are not held together by monuments alone. They depend on food, trust, roads, memory, legitimacy, weather, labour, and belief. The most enduring legacy of Hattusa may be its long misrecognition. For centuries the capital stands under the sky, but its identity is lost. This is a humbling fact. The past does not always hide because it has vanished. Sometimes it hides because later generations do not know how to see it. Stones without language become anonymous. Archives without readers become hardened clay. Sacred images without their rituals become strange carvings. Hattusa teaches that history requires evidence but also attention. It requires the patience to connect a broken tablet to a ruined room to a city to an empire, and an empire to the wider movements of the ancient world. Today, the ruins of Hattusa are recognized as one of the great archaeological landscapes of Turkey and one of the key sites for understanding the Bronze Age Near East. Yet recognition does not remove the silence from the place, it deepens it. A visitor walking there now knows more than the travellers who once saw only mysterious ruins, but the wind still moves through empty gates. The temples remain roofless. The palace is gone. The scribes are gone. The king's road no longer carries orders. The gods of the capital no longer receive offerings in their ancient sequence. Knowledge restores meaning, but it cannot restore the living city. That is why Hattusa remains powerful. It is not only a rediscovered capital, it is a reminder that historical memory is fragile, uneven, and often unfair. Some cities become symbols across the world. Others equally important in their time wait in obscurity until scholarship reopens them. Hattusa waited in stone and clay. It waited through empire after empire, through languages it never knew, through seasons that wore down its walls but did not erase them. When it finally returned to history, it did not return as a legend made simple. It returned as something richer, a real ancient capital, magnificent, anxious, sacred, bureaucratic, violent, cosmopolitan, vulnerable, and unfinished. The city no one recognized for centuries is now recognized again, but its deepest lesson may be that recognition is never final. Every generation looks at the past with different eyes. Every excavation, every rereading, every fragment may change the balance of what is known and what remains uncertain. Hattusa stands as a capital remembered again, not because it was always understood, but because enough of it endured for understanding to become possible. On the high Anatolian plateau, the stones still hold their positions. The gates still face the old approaches. The tablets once buried in ruin still carry the pressure of vanished hands. And through them, a forgotten empire continues to return slowly, incompletely, but unmistakably from the silence. And so the story of Hattusa settles back into the landscape where it began. The great capital is no longer crowded with officials, priests, soldiers, envoys, animals, scribes, and workers. The roads that once carried royal commands now lead through ruins and open air. The walls no longer guard a king. The gates no longer measure the passage between imperial order and the uncertain world beyond. Yet the place remains changed from a seat of power into a vessel of memory. There is something quietly enduring in that transformation. A civilization rises, gathers gods and laws, writes treaties, builds walls, stores grain, sends armies fears, its enemies trusts its rituals and imagines that the center will hold. Then time moves across it. Roofs fall, names fade, languages die. The living city becomes a puzzle for people not yet born. What once seemed permanent becomes evidence. What once seemed ordinary becomes precious. A tablet made for administration becomes a voice across thousands of years. A gate built to intimidate becomes a threshold into understanding. A forgotten capital becomes a reminder that even power depends on being remembered. Hattusa does not return as it was. No ancient city ever does. It returns in fragments, a carved lion, a broken treaty, a temple foundation, a weathered procession of gods, a royal name pressed into clay. These fragments cannot rebuild the old streets or refill the storerooms or restore the sound of festivals moving through the capital. But they can offer something quieter. They can show that disappearance is not always complete, and that beneath silence there may still be a structure waiting to be understood. Across the plateau, evening would soften the stones. Shadows would gather in the old gateways. The wind would move over the grass where walls once rose higher, where messengers once arrived with urgent news, where scribes once bent over damp clay preserving a world they never expected to lose. The city that stood unrecognized for centuries now rests under its recovered name, still incomplete, still mysterious, but no longer nameless. And in that final image, Hattusa remains a capital of kings returned to the quiet, a ruin that waited longer than empires, a place where history nearly forgot itself, and then slowly learned to remember.